Hey there, tonight we're diving into the bewildering world of Victorian asylums, where the truth is that your biggest worry wouldn't be the patients. It's the doctors and their utterly bonkers cures. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise or grab your favorite blanket, and let's drift into tonight's story together. Your eyes blink open to a ceiling that looks like it hasn't seen a good scrub since Queen Victoria was in nappies. Welcome to the Victorian Asylum, where the concept of personal space is about as real as a unicorn. You're in a dormitory, if you can call a room crammed full of iron-framed beds a dormitory. The air is as cold as a banker's heart, and the smell, well, let's just say it's a delicate bouquet of damp wool and despair. The Victorians were all about routine, so you're not here to enjoy a leisurely lie-in. Nope, you're up with the crows, or rather, the asylum attendants. It's barely dawn, and already they're bustling about, dragging you and your fellow inmates, patients, into the day. The 19th century was a time when mental health was less about understanding and more about, how fast can we get this person out of sight? By 1845, there were over 20,000 people in asylums across England and Wales. They were popping up faster than pop-up ads, driven by a mix of social anxiety and a dash of good old-fashioned moral panic. Your morning starts with a splash, literally. Cold water to the face is the Victorian equivalent of a triple shot espresso, and it's cheaper too. But let's not get too comfortable. There's no time for a leisurely morning routine when you've got a strict schedule to adhere to. This place runs like clockwork, and you're just another cog in the machine. Breakfast is next, but don't get your hopes up. The menu is about as exciting as the wallpaper, which is to say, not at all. Porridge, thin and watery, is served with a side of judgment. The Victorians weren't big on flavour, they were more about functionality. If it fills you up and doesn't kill you, it's good enough. You might wonder how you ended up here, in this bastion of 19th century mental health care. It turns out, back in the day, you could earn a one-way ticket to an asylum for a whole host of reasons. Melancholy, hysteria, epilepsy, or just being a tad too eccentric for your neighbours' liking could land you a spot. The Victorians had a term for it, moral insanity, which sounds like something a poet would write about, but really it was a catch-all for anyone who didn't fit the mould. Back to breakfast, where the chatter is as hushed as a library. The staff keep a close eye on everyone. After all, they're not just serving porridge, they're maintaining order, and order was crucial in these institutions. The 19th century saw a massive boom in asylums, fueled by the Lunacy Act of 1845, which made it mandatory for every county to have at least one public asylum. These were not places of healing so much as places of containment, the societal broom under which the dust of mental illness was swept. But let's not get too caught up in the grim realities just yet. You've got a whole day ahead in this Victorian wonderland. As you slurp your porridge, you can't help but think about the people around you, each with their own stories that led them here, to this place of regimented routine and questionable care. It's a sobering thought, one that might make you grateful for the more enlightened approaches to mental health we have today. But back in your dormitory, the thin blankets and even thinner mattresses remind you that comfort wasn't exactly a priority in the Victorian era. And speaking of priorities, personal hygiene was one area where the Victorians were still figuring things out. Communal living meant baths were a luxury, not a right. If you're lucky, you might get a wash once a week. The cold, hard truth is that many residents lived in these conditions for years, sometimes their entire lives. The idea of rehabilitation was still in its infancy, overshadowed by the more pressing concern of keeping everyone in line and out of sight. As you wrap up breakfast and prepare for the day's activities, it's clear that the Victorian asylum was a product of its time, an era when science and pseudoscience walked hand in hand, and societal norms dictated that anything unfamiliar should be tucked away behind high walls and iron gates. If you're thinking this sounds a bit grim, well, you're not wrong. But hold on, because the day is just getting started, and there's plenty more Victorian absurdity to uncover before the sun sets on this peculiar chapter of history. As your day kicks off in this Victorian asylum, Let's get cozy with the concept of treatment, but brace yourself. It's about as comforting as a cactus in your armchair. Welcome to the era of moral treatment, where the idea was to reform your mind through a strict regimen of work, discipline, and a smidge of moral instruction. Sounds delightful, doesn't it? Picture this. You've just finished your thin porridge, and you're herded off for your daily dose of labor. You see, the Victorians believed that idleness was the devil's playground, so they kept everyone busy. If you were lucky, garden duty awaited. If not, say hello to the laundry room, a steamy inferno where the only thing harder than the water was the unspoken competition to survive the day without collapsing from exhaustion. Work therapy, they called it, an idea that still lingers today, albeit in a far less Dickensian fashion. But moral treatment was more than just keeping your hands busy. It was a full-on lifestyle overhaul. The asylum was your world, and the goal was to shape you into a functioning member of society, or at least what the Victorians thought that looked like. And in this world, conformity was king. Got an unpopular opinion or a penchant for, say, wearing purple socks on Thursdays? Best keep that to yourself. Now, here's the kicker. Despite the noble intentions, the whole setup was often more about control than cure. Many of these asylums were bursting at the seams, housing way more patients than they were ever designed to accommodate. By 1859, places like the Colney Hatch Asylum in London were home to over 500 souls, though they were meant for far fewer. The overcrowding wasn't just a logistical nightmare. It was an economic strategy. More patients meant more funding from the government, so the more, the merrier. Or, the opposite of that. Let's not forget the delightful array of medical practices. The Victorian era was a time when science and superstition had a standing dinner date. Aside from moral treatment, you might get lucky with a round of bloodletting, because who doesn't love a good leech to start the day? Or perhaps you prefer the soothing hum of electrotherapy, where a gentle zap was believed to realign your mental biorhythms, or something equally pseudo-scientific. The Victorians had a knack for making the bizarre sound almost plausible. But why were these methods so popular? Well, the Victorians had a love affair with the notion of a quick fix, a one-size-fits-all solution to the complex problem of mental illness. And when you're dealing with the human brain, which is about as predictable as an English summer, these treatments were more about trial and error than tried and true. The truth is, many patients were subjected to treatments that had all the scientific rigor of a fortune teller's crystal ball. While we're on the subject of ill-conceived notions, let's not forget the economic engine driving this whole enterprise. Asylums were a booming business. With the Lunacy Act of 1845 mandating public asylums, the government was keen to get those establishments filled to the rafters. After all, no one wanted to see the mentally ill wandering the streets. Oh, the horror. So, into the asylums they went, with the costs neatly tucked away from the public eye. And here's where it gets really twisted. The more people you could cram into an asylum, the more funding you got. It was like a grim version of musical chairs, with the only music being the sound of overworked staff trying to maintain order. By the late 19th century, the annual cost of keeping someone in an asylum ranged from £15 to £30. Compared to modern standards, it sounds like a bargain until you consider the conditions. A bargain basement price for bargain basement care. But let's not get too cynical. There were those who genuinely believed they were doing good. Reformers like John Connolly, who ran the Hanwell Asylum, advocated for the abolition of restraints and believed in treating patients with dignity. Noble, yes, but in a system more interested in numbers than nuance. Such ideals often got lost in the shuffle. So, as you shuffle through your day here, remember that each step, each task, each treatment is part of a grand experiment, a Victorian attempt to decode the human mind, albeit with the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. And while it's easy to scoff at the absurdity, let's not forget that even now, the quest to understand mental health is ongoing. We've come a long way since the days of moral treatment and electrotherapy, but the echoes of that era still linger. As the day wears on, you might get a moment to yourself. A rare luxury, yes, but time alone is a double-edged sword in a place like this. On one hand, it's a chance to breathe, to think, to be. On the other, it's a reminder of the walls that confine you, the system that sees you as a number rather than a name. And as you contemplate your place in this Victorian experiment, remember that history is a tapestry of lessons learned. and sometimes not learned. Stay tuned, because our journey through the curious corridors of the Victorian Asylum is far from over. There's more to discover, more to question, and definitely more to laugh about, albeit with a touch of gallows humor. But that's the thing about history. It's never just black and white. It's a kaleidoscope of contradictions, where the absurd and the profound often go hand in hand. So, as the sun reaches its zenith, and you're granted a sliver of unstructured time in this Victorian mental health menagerie, let's dive into the activities that pass for leisure around here. Spoiler alert, it's less Netflix and chill, more basket weaving and chill. And by chill, I mean the kind that comes from a drafty room where you're expected to keep busy, not entertained. Welcome to the leisure time of a Victorian asylum, where activities are less about self-expression and more about keeping you from staring too long at the walls. The Victorians, bless them, believed that constructive work was the key to mental rehabilitation. And by constructive, I mean anything that wouldn't cost the institution a penny more than necessary. So, you might find yourself threading a needle or weaving a basket, a pastime that's about as thrilling as watching a pot of porridge come to a boil. Why baskets, you might ask? Because they're easy, cheap, and don't require a 5-year plan. Plus, there's something oddly satisfying about taking a jumble of reeds and turning it into something vaguely functional. This was Victorian occupational therapy, the idea that if you kept your hands busy, your mind would follow suit. It's the same logic behind giving a toddler a coloring book, except in this case, the crayons are missing and the paper is probably damp. Now, let's talk about why these activities were chosen. Victorian society was all about order and productivity. If you were knitting, sewing, or weaving, you were contributing to the asylum's economy. Because why hire a seamstress when you've got a room full of potential labor just waiting to be tapped? It was a win-win situation, assuming you define winning as having no choice but to work for free. The products of your labor, be it baskets or knitted goods, could be sold to help fund the institution, a neat little economic circle that kept the asylum's coffers full and your mind, theoretically, less insane. But here's the kicker. This was less about rehabilitation and more about cost-effective labor. The Victorians were nothing if not pragmatic when it came to balancing the books. They managed to turn asylums into self-sustaining entities, with patients providing the labor under the guise of therapy. This wasn't exactly a secret, but it wasn't plastered on the asylum walls either. It's like the world's least enticing chain gang, minus the chains, plus a side of moral superiority. And if you're thinking, hey, what about some art therapy? Well, you'd be barking up the wrong Victorian tree. The 19th century mindset was more about suppression than expression. Art was seen as frivolous, the kind of thing that led to dangerous flights of fancy, and heaven forbid, creativity. No, it was best to keep things grounded, practical, and devoid of any potential for self-exploration. If you wanted to express yourself, you'd better do it through the medium of perfectly symmetrical basket handles. These activities were deeply entrenched in societal norms that valued conformity over individuality. The Victorians were big on the idea that everyone had their place, and that place was rarely outside the lines of what was deemed acceptable. Deviate from the norm, and you might find yourself weaving baskets in an asylum with the best of them. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, or rather, it is, but with a side of irony. The very activities meant to rehabilitate patients often serve to reinforce the very constraints they purported to heal. It's a bit like trying to quench your thirst with a glass of salt water. The intentions were there, but the execution left much to be desired. You see, the Victorian era was a paradox of progress and prudence. On one hand, it was a time of great scientific advancements and a burgeoning understanding of mental health. On the other, it was a period of profound ignorance, where the solutions often felt like they were dreamed up by someone who'd never actually met a person with mental illness. The notion of curing the mind through repetitive chores was rooted in a mix of optimism and naivete, an earnest, if misguided, attempt to apply the Industrial Revolution's efficiency to the human psyche. As you dutifully engage in your allotted task, you might start to wonder if these activities ever really helped anyone. And while it's easy to dismiss them as futile today, back then, they represented a step, albeit a small one, toward a more humane approach to mental health. Before the asylum system, many with mental illnesses were left to fend for themselves on the streets or locked away in grim, unsanitary conditions. The activities, though tedious and exploitative, were at least a shift away from outright neglect. And let's not forget the economic engine chugging along in the background. The cost of running an asylum was substantial, and any way to offset those costs was welcomed with open arms. By engaging patients in productive work, asylums could reduce expenses and create a semblance of order within their walls. It was a system where everyone had a role to play, however small and thankless it might be. So, as your fingers work their way through another round of monotonous weaving, remember that this is all part of the grand Victorian experiment, a time when society was grappling with the complexities of the mind in ways that were both groundbreaking and bizarre. The activities may have been repetitive, but they were also a reflection of an era trying, and often failing, to understand the human condition. In the end, these leisure activities were less about leisure, and more about maintaining a semblance of order within a system that was as much about control as it was care. They were a product of their time, a testament to an age where the lines between treatment and exploitation were as blurred as the view through a rain-soaked window. And as the sun begins to set on another day in the Victorian Asylum, you might find a grim sense of humor in it all, a reminder that, sometimes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. As the clock ticks on, and the afternoon sun slants through barred windows, casting long shadows across the asylum's stone floors, let's talk about the legal loopholes and social quirks that made entering a Victorian asylum easier than getting out of a particularly sticky social engagement. First up on our legal joyride is something called the Lunacy Act of 1845. This little piece of legislation was the brainchild of a society that preferred its problems out of sight and out of mind. It mandated every county to have at least one public asylum, a seemingly benevolent move, unless you were the poor soul trying to claw your way out of one. The process of getting someone committed was about as rigorous as a paper napkin in a hurricane. All it took was a couple of doctors' signatures on a piece of paper, and voila, one-way ticket to the land of eternal nightgowns and watery porridge. The Victorians were nothing if not efficient when it came to bureaucratic processes, especially those involving social order. The entry process was so streamlined that even the slightest whiff of eccentricity could land you in a padded cell. A woman who enjoyed reading too much, hysteria. A man who argued too fervently at the pub, melancholy. Asylum doors swung open wide for all sorts of undesirables, from the truly mentally ill to those simply inconvenient to polite society. It was like a catch-all basket of societal misfits, only less cozy and more claustrophobic. Now, once you were snugly tucked away inside, getting out was a whole different ball game. The exit process was more convoluted than a Victorian novel's plot twist. You might think a simple, "I'm feeling better now," would suffice, but no. Patients needed to demonstrate their sanity to the very system that deemed them insane in the first place. Imagine convincing a jury of your peers that you're not mad while wearing a nightshirt that doubles as a straitjacket. Talk about a hard sell. But let's not ignore the societal factors that kept the asylum beds perpetually warm. The Victorian era was a time of rapid industrialization, and with it came a surge in urban populations. As cities grew, so did the visibility of homelessness and poverty, both considered unsightly blemishes on the face of a civilized society. Asylums became convenient repositories for those who didn't fit the mold, the poor, the elderly, the rebellious. It was like sweeping dust under an ornate rug and then declaring the room clean. From an economic standpoint, the asylums were a mixed bag. On one hand, they were costly to maintain. After all, feeding and housing thousands of people was no small task. On the other hand, they were an investment in social stability, a way to keep the streets free of those deemed unfit for public life. The government poured money into these institutions, driven by a belief that a well-ordered society was a prosperous one. But prosperity came at a price, and that price was often paid by those who found themselves on the wrong side of the asylum walls. Let's talk about those walls, both literal and metaphorical, that kept people inside. The stigma surrounding mental health was as thick as London fog. Admitting you had a problem was akin to social suicide, so once you were in, staying in seemed the path of least resistance. Families often left relatives in asylums indefinitely, driven by shame or sheer necessity. It was easier to leave Aunt Edna in the care of the state than to explain her peculiar habits to the neighbors. Yet, within these walls, there existed a society unto itself, governed by its own rules and hierarchies. Patients formed bands, rivalries, and alliances in a microcosm of Victorian society. The outside world may have shut them away, but inside, life went on with its own peculiar rhythms. Some patients even found a semblance of normalcy within the confines, participating in the routine of daily tasks and forming communities that, despite the circumstances, offered a sense of belonging. Now, let's bust a myth while we're at it. The romantic notion of the asylum as a place of refuge and rehabilitation is about as accurate as a Victorian parket watch after a roll down a cobblestone street. While there were reformers who genuinely sought to improve conditions, the reality was often far grimmer. Overcrowding was rampant. By the late 19th century, some institutions housed twice as many patients as they were designed to accommodate. Imagine sleeping in a room so packed that turning over in bed was a coordinated group effort. Despite these grim realities, the idea of the asylum as a place of respite persisted in popular culture. It was a narrative that offered comfort to those on the outside, a way to rationalize the existence of such places by casting them in a benevolent light. But the truth was that for many, the asylum was less a sanctuary and more a sentence. As you ponder these contradictions, remember that the Victorian asylum was a product of its time, a time of rapid change, rigid social norms, and a fledgling understanding of mental health. It was an era when science and superstition were often indistinguishable, and societal pressures dictated that anything deemed abnormal be hidden away. Asylums served as both a solution and a symptom of a society grappling with the complexities of modern life. So, as afternoon rolls into evening and the shadows grow longer, keep in mind that the story of the Victorian asylum is far from over. There are more layers to peel back, more myths to debunk, and more absurdities to uncover. The past may be a foreign country, but it's one that offers a wealth of lessons, some learned, others still echoing unanswered through the halls of history. Stay tuned, because the journey through this peculiar chapter of the past is just beginning. And so, as the Victorian asylum's day nears its end, the shadows stretch long and lean, much like the truth behind their walls. Let's dim the lights on the romanticized idea of asylums as sanctuaries of healing. What you might have heard is a tale spun with more fiction than fact, a sepia-toned portrait of earnest doctors and serene gardens. The reality, well, was less Downton Abbey and more American Horror Story. Now, don't get me wrong. There were reformers who tried to turn the ship around before it hit the iceberg. Enter the likes of Dorothea Dix, an American social reformer who toured asylums in the 1840 and campaigned for better conditions, leaving bureaucrats quaking in their top hats. Her reports highlighted the abysmal conditions, and yet change was as slow as a snail on a leisurely stroll. Even John Connolly, who banned mechanical restraints at Hanwell, could only do so much. Reform was more of a polite suggestion than a command. But why was the asylum system so resistant to change? Well, blame it on a cocktail of Victorian values and economic constraints. Asylums were a financial tightrope walk. They needed to appear benevolent to secure funding while keeping costs lower than a snake's belly. The math was simple. More patients equaled more funding. A neat trick if you could ignore the human cost, which, as history shows, they often did. And then came the media, doing what it does best, adding fuel to the fire with a side of sensationalism. Newspapers of the era loved a good scandal, especially one that involved the mysterious goings-on behind asylum walls. Stories, often exaggerated, turned these institutions into houses of horror in the public imagination. Think less treatment center, more Gothic nightmare. In 1877, The Lancet published exposés that read like a Stephen King novel, detailing overcrowding and abuse. The public, ever hungry for drama, ate it up faster than a Victorian at a pie-eating contest. The effect of this media sensationalism was twofold. On one hand, it sparked outrage and calls for reform. On the other, it cemented the asylum's place in the public's nightmares. It was the Victorian version of clickbait, and it worked, both to horrify and to sell papers. Yet, amidst the outrage, the reality of reform was often as elusive as an honest politician. And while we're debunking myths, let's tackle the idea that these places were ever truly about rehabilitation. The Victorian asylum system was a band-aid on a bullet wound. It was more about managing the problem than solving it. Society wanted a tidy solution to the messy business of mental illness, and asylums offered just that, a place to put people out of sight and conveniently out of mind. Now, you might be wondering why any of this still matters today. Surely, we've moved on from such draconian practices. Well, yes and no. While modern mental health care has certainly evolved, the echoes of the asylum era still linger. The stigma surrounding mental illness, fueled by centuries of misunderstanding and fear, remains a stubborn spectre. Even today, discussions about mental health often tiptoe around the uncomfortable truths, much like a Victorian lady avoiding a puddle. Moreover, the economic pressures that shape the asylum system continue to influence modern healthcare. Budget cuts, underfunded services, and overcrowded facilities are all too familiar in today's headlines. The lessons of the past, about the dangers of valuing economy over empathy, seem to slip through our fingers like grains of sand, reminding us that history, if not learned from, is doomed to repeat itself. So, as you step back from this whirlwind tour of Victorian asylums, take a moment to ponder the legacy they've left behind. They were a product of their time, a reflection of a society grappling with change, yet shackled by tradition. They remind us of the human tendency to fear what we don't understand and to hide away what makes us uncomfortable. But they also serve as a testament to progress, however slow and imperfect it may be. In the end, the story of the Victorian asylum is one of contrasts, a blend of hope and horror, reform and resistance, progress and prejudice. It's a chapter in history that challenges us to question our assumptions and to strive for a more compassionate future. And while we may never fully unravel the complexities of the human mind, we can at least strive to approach it with curiosity and kindness rather than with the cold calculus of Victorian pragmatism. So there you have it, the Victorian asylum in all its grimly fascinating glory. A place where the best of intentions often went awry and where the lessons learned, or not, echo through the corridors of time. As you tuck this knowledge away, remember that history is a tapestry woven with the threads of human experience, messy, complex, and endlessly intriguing. And as the sun sets on this chapter, let it illuminate the path to understanding and empathy, a journey worth taking even in the darkest of times. In the grand carousel of medieval history, one figure stands out as a bit of a unicorn: Charlemagne, the man who could wield a sword and a quill with almost equal flair. Born around 742 AD, give or take, since medieval record-keeping wasn't exactly a paragon of precision. Charlemagne's early life in the Frankish kingdom was less about fairy tales and more about surviving a game of political musical chairs. His dad, Pepin the Short, was a Frankish king who, despite the nickname, cast a long shadow. Pepin had a knack for power plays, like convincing the Pope to crown him king, which was the medieval equivalent of getting the CEO to give you a promotion over lunch. Charlemagne grew up in a world where literacy was about as common as unicorns, yet somehow he got the memo that education might be a game-changer. While most noble kids were busy perfecting their sword-swinging skills or jousting for fun, Charlemagne was sneaking peeks at Latin texts. Let's not kid ourselves. He wasn't reading War and Peace, but in a time when knowing your ABCs could set you apart, Charlemagne's interest in books was downright revolutionary. He reportedly learned to read late in life, which is a bit like deciding to take up yoga in your 60s. Commendable, if slightly unusual. Europe in the 8th century was the kind of place where you'd want a good travel agent. The continent was a patchwork quilt of tiny kingdoms, principalities, and tribes all jostling for land and power. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed a few centuries earlier, leaving a power vacuum that made Game of Thrones look like a peace conference. The Frankish kingdom, where Charlemagne was cutting his teeth, was a rising star in this chaotic sky, a realm carved out by Pepin's ambition and military might. The political landscape was as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. The Lombards were causing headaches in Italy, the Saxons were being their rebellious selves up north, and the Moors were holding court in Spain. Charlemagne's family tree was more twisted than a soap opera plot, with alliances and rivalries sprouting like weeds in a garden. His father had already set the stage by overthrowing the last Merovingian king, Childeric Roman III, who was probably as useful as a chocolate teapot. Pepin then handed Charlemagne a kingdom that was not only geographically sprawling, but also politically volatile. Charlemagne's early education, if you could call it that, was a blend of martial training and the occasional dip into the world of letters. His court was more about the clang of swords than the rustle of parchment, but Charlemagne had a vision that went beyond the battlefield. He saw the potential for a united Europe long before it was fashionable, perhaps because he realized that a fractured Europe was as dangerous as a pyromaniac in a match factory. In 768, when Pepin the Short finally shuffled off this mortal coil, Charlemagne and his brother Carloman were handed the keys to the kingdom, literally. It was a classic medieval power-sharing arrangement, which is to say, doomed from the start. Carloman and Charlemagne got along like cats and dogs, and though Carloman's untimely death in 771 solved that particular sibling rivalry, it was less about family therapy and more about political expediency. With Carloman out of the picture, Charlemagne seized the opportunity like a kid in a candy store. He expanded the Frankish Empire through a series of military campaigns that were as relentless as they were strategic. By the time he was done, he had not only stitched together a patchwork of territories, but also set in motion the idea of a unified Europe, a concept that would take a few more centuries to catch on properly, mind you. Charlemagne's love of learning didn't just stop with reading. He became a patron of the Carolingian Renaissance, a cultural and intellectual revival that was like a medieval Kickstarter for the arts and education. He gathered scholars from across Europe, making his court at Aachen a kind of proto-university where ideas flowed as freely as the wine at a royal banquet. But let's not romanticize too much. Charlemagne was as flawed as any ruler. His campaigns against the Saxons were brutal, featuring forced conversions that would make even the most zealous missionary wince. His reign was marked by a mix of visionary policies and ruthless tactics, a blend that made him both revered and feared. In the end, Charlemagne was a paradox, a warrior who valued education, a ruler who sought unity through conquest, and a man who could see beyond the horizon of his time. His early life set the stage for a reign that would redefine the contours of Europe and earn him the moniker Father of Europe. Not too shabby for a guy who had to share his kingdom with a brother named Carloman. Charlemagne's vision for a unified Europe was less a dreamy ideal and more a relentless pursuit. He didn't waste time with wishful thinking. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work, expanding his empire like it was a medieval version of Monopoly. His grand strategy, a cocktail of military muscle, strategic alliances, and a smattering of diplomacy, though diplomacy often involved a pointed sword and a not-so-gentle nudge. But let's not sugarcoat it. Charlemagne's interactions with the Saxons were about as peaceful as a rock concert marsh pit. His campaign against them was a decades-long saga that resembled an epic soap opera, minus the romance, and plus a lot more bloodshed. Between 772 and 804, Charlemagne launched no fewer than 18 campaigns against the Saxons. That's right, 18. Talk about persistence. It was like Groundhog Day, but with more axes and fewer groundhogs. What made the Saxons such a thorn in Charlemagne's side? For starters, they were fiercely independent, and their idea of a good time didn't include being annexed by a foreign power or converting to Christianity. Charlemagne, however, was not one to take no for an answer. His solution: if at first you don't succeed, try again, preferably with more troops. And so it went, with Charlemagne's forces marching into Saxon territory, subduing it, only for the Saxons to rebel as soon as his back was turned. It was a classic case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, except each step was marked by battle and betrayal. The infamous massacre of Verdun in 782 was a particularly grim chapter in this saga. Charlemagne ordered the execution of 500 Saxon rebels in a single day, a move that would make even the most ruthless dictator pause. This brutal act, intended to break Saxon resistance, instead fueled further rebellion. Charlemagne learned the hard way that fear can be a powerful motivator, but it's not great for building lasting loyalty. Despite the bloodshed, Charlemagne wasn't just swinging swords for the sake of it. His campaigns had a clear economic motive. Controlling Saxon lands opened up vital trade routes, including those connecting the North Sea with the rest of Europe. In medieval terms, this was like having a VIP pass to the hardest trade party in town. With control over these routes, Charlemagne could ensure that goods, wealth, and influence flowed directly to his empire, enhancing his power and prestige. But it wasn't all about the Saxons. Charlemagne's empire building involved a blend of carrot and stick approaches across the continent. He knew that military might alone wouldn't hold his territories together, so he married off relatives, forged alliances, and doled out titles like party favors. His marriage to Hildegard of Windsgau in 771, for instance, wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a strategic alliance that solidified his power base in the region. And let's talk money. Charlemagne understood that an empire runs on coin as much as on conquest. The Carolingian economy was a patchwork of agriculture, trade, and tribute, with the emperor acting as the ultimate tax collector. He standardized weights and measures, a move that might sound dull but was revolutionary in its time. By creating a uniform system, he facilitated trade across his vast realm. Think of it as the medieval version of establishing a common currency. Meanwhile, in the south, Charlemagne was eyeing the Moors in Spain with a mix of ambition and caution. His campaigns, they were not about outright conquest, but rather establishing a buffer zone, a kind of medieval DMZ to keep the Islamic influence at bay. The Battle of Roncesvalles Pass in 778 was a stark reminder of the challenges in this region. Despite its romanticized portrayal in the Song of Roland, in reality, it was a disastrous defeat for Charlemagne's rearguard, ambushed by Basque forces. It was one of those ouch moments in military history that showed even the great Charlemagne wasn't invincible. Despite setbacks, Charlemagne's expansionist policy was largely successful, transforming the Frankish kingdom into the Carolingian Empire, the largest European empire since the fall of Rome. By the time he was crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD by Pope Leo Roman III, Charlemagne had secured his legacy as a unifier of Western Europe. But this crowning was not just a ceremonial pat on the back. It was a calculated power play. The title of emperor gave him legitimacy and prestige, both crucial in maintaining control over his sprawling territories. Yet, for all his successes, Charlemagne's reign was a constant balancing act. He had to keep the various factions within his empire from tearing each other apart while fending off external threats. It was like juggling flaming swords while riding a unicycle on a tightrope. One slip, and everything could come crashing down. So, was Charlemagne a visionary leader or a ruthless conqueror? The truth is, he was a bit of both. He united much of Western Europe under one banner, laying the groundwork for the modern nation-states we recognize today. But he also left a trail of destruction in his wake, with countless lives lost in his quest for power. His reign was a testament to the complexities of leadership in a turbulent era, a time when the line between hero and villain was as blurred as the ink in a medieval scribe's manuscript. As we wrap up this chapter of Charlemagne's story, it's clear that his legacy is as multifaceted as the man himself. He was a warrior, a scholar, a statesman, and a tyrant all rolled into one, a blend of contradictions that makes his story as compelling today as it was over a millennium ago. But don't put away your history books just yet. There's more to explore in the saga of Charlemagne, the father of Europe, whose impact would ripple through the centuries like a stone cast into a still pond. As the curtain rises on Charlemagne's next act, we find our medieval maestro not just content with expanding borders and bashing Saxons. Nope, Charlemagne had a new ambition, convincing the people of Europe that reading was the new black. In a world where literacy was about as popular as a dentist appointment, this was no small feat. The man was on a mission to transform his empire from a land of grunting swordsmen to a bastion of letters and learning. Talk about ambitious, right? Enter the Carolingian Renaissance, Charlemagne's grand cultural reboot. Imagine a medieval Kickstarter campaign with Charlemagne as the lead backer. This Renaissance wasn't just about sprucing up the royal library. It was an all-hands-on-deck attempt to drag Europe out of the intellectual dark ages. By gathering scholars from far and wide, Charlemagne turned his court at Aachen into a proto-university, where Latin was the lingua franca and parchment was the new papyrus. But hold your horses, folks. This wasn't just an altruistic quest for enlightenment. Charlemagne had a political ace up his sleeve. By painting himself as the cultural savior of the West, he was also busy crafting a legacy that would make even the most stoic historian weep. It was a PR campaign that would make any modern spin doctor proud. But was it all just for show? Well, that's where the plot thickens. Charlemagne's educational reforms were as much about power as they were about pedagogy. By promoting literacy, he could ensure that his decrees weren't just heard through the medieval grapevine, but actually read and understood. This was crucial for maintaining control over his sprawling empire, where communication was slower than a snail on a lazy Sunday. It's like getting everyone on the same Wi-Fi network, a logistical nightmare. But once you're connected, the possibilities are endless. To facilitate this transformation, Charlemagne needed a brain trust. Enter Alcuin of York, the English scholar who became Charlemagne's intellectual wingman. Alcuin was like the Yoda to Charlemagne's Luke Skywalker, guiding him in the ways of wisdom and learning. Together, they overhauled the education system, emphasizing the trivium and quadrivium, the medieval equivalent of core curriculum subjects. Grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were the building blocks of Charlemagne's academic empire. And let's not forget the Carolingian minuscule, a new, streamlined script that made reading and writing more accessible. This was a game changer, folks. Think of it as the medieval version of Times New Roman, designed to make text more readable and less like a Jackson Pollock painting. The minuscule script would later influence the development of modern European scripts, proving that sometimes small changes have big impacts. But was everyone on board with Charlemagne's vision of enlightenment? The short answer, not really. Many of his subjects were more interested in the practicalities of survival than in parsing Latin declensions. After all, you can't eat a manuscript. Yet Charlemagne persisted, perhaps realizing that a well-educated populace was less likely to rebel, a lesson some rulers today could take notes on. Despite the challenges, Charlemagne's cultural reforms left an indelible mark. By the time he passed the torch, or rather, the scepter, in 814 AD, his educational policies had laid the groundwork for a more intellectually vibrant Europe. The Carolingian Renaissance was not just a flash in the pan, but a slow burn that would eventually light the way for the High Middle Ages and beyond. But before we get too misty-eyed about Charlemagne, the Scholar King, let's not forget the man was also a master of optics. His efforts to promote learning were as much about bolstering his own image as they were about elevating his subjects. By positioning himself as the patron of knowledge, Charlemagne was able to fortify his rule with the kind of legitimacy that only a learned king could claim. It was a savvy move in a time when power was often measured by the length of your sword rather than the breadth of your library. In the end, Charlemagne's quest for cultural revival was a mix of genuine passion and shrewd strategy. He understood that to rule effectively, you needed more than just muscle. You needed brains, and lots of them. His legacy as a cultural icon was as carefully constructed as the stone arches of his palaces, built to stand the test of time. So, was Charlemagne a true believer in the power of education, or was he just playing the long game? Perhaps it was a bit of both. He was a man who could see the potential of learning to transform society, but he was also acutely aware of the political capital it could bring. Like a master chess player, he knew that every move had to serve multiple purposes. As we ponder Charlemagne's impact on the cultural landscape of medieval Europe, it's clear that his story is far from over. His vision of a learned and united Europe would continue to inspire generations, laying the groundwork for the intellectual renaissances that followed. But for now, let's leave Charlemagne in his archon court, surrounded by scholars and scrolls, a king dreaming of a brighter, more enlightened future. There's more to explore in his saga, so don't roll the credits just yet. The tale of Charlemagne, the cultural crusader, is one for the ages. And speaking of bright futures, let's talk about the moment when Charlemagne's star ascended to a whole new galaxy of medieval power. No, we're not talking about him inventing a medieval version of the internet or anything, though given his pace of reform, it wouldn't have been surprising. Instead, we're diving into the legendary event of 800 AD, Charlemagne's crowning as Holy Roman Emperor. It was a day filled with pomp, circumstance, and more political maneuvering than a modern election campaign. Picture this. It's Christmas Day, 800 AD. While most of us would be stuffing our faces with turkey or the medieval equivalent, Charlemagne was busy getting crowned by none other than Pope Leo Roman III in St. Peter's Basilica. Now, if that doesn't scream holiday spirit, I don't know what does. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't just about festive cheer and goodwill. No, this was a shrewd political chess move with more layers than a Byzantine mosaic. First, let's set the scene. Pope Leo Roman III, the pontiff in question, was having a bit of a rough patch. Imagine trying to run the church when your enemies were as plentiful as fleas on a medieval mutt. Leo had faced accusations of corruption and even a not-so-friendly street ambush. Who do you call when your papal authority's crumbling faster than a sandcastle at high tide? Enter Charlemagne, the ultimate medieval fixer-upper. Charlemagne, on the other hand, was already the king of the Franks and Lombards. He had expanded his empire more efficiently than a medieval startup going public. But here's the kicker. Despite his vast territories and impressive track record of military conquests, there was still one badge missing from his collection, a title that would put him on par with the emperors of old Rome. And Pope Leo, with his political woes, found himself in need of a strong ally who could provide military support and restore his auctoritas, his authority, in layman's terms. So, the two struck a deal that would make any modern politician nod in approval. Charlemagne would lend his military muscle to the Pope, and in return, Leo would grant him the ultimate medieval endorsement, the title of Holy Roman Emperor. It was like a medieval quid pro quo, with a heavy dash of theatrics. Now, there's a delicious irony here. Charlemagne, the man who reportedly couldn't write his own name without a ghostwriter, was being crowned by a pope who needed his protection to keep his seat. It's like a plot twist in a Shakespearean play, where the hero gets crowned by the very institution he's been propping up. Some say Charlemagne was caught off guard by the whole affair, as if Leo had decided to throw in a surprise gift with his coronation package. Others suggest it was premeditated, a carefully orchestrated piece of political theatre. Either way, the symbolism was clear. The Pope was elevating Charlemagne, and in doing so, reminding everyone who really held the keys to the heavenly kingdom. But let's not get starry-eyed about this divine appointment. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was as much about earthly power as it was about heavenly grace. By accepting the crown, Charlemagne wasn't just gaining a shiny new title, he was also accepting the complex web of responsibilities and challenges that came with it. His new role implied that he was the protector of the church, a unifier of Christendom, and a ruler whose authority was ordained by God himself. Talk about pressure. The implications for European politics were seismic. With Charlemagne's coronation, the idea of a unified Christian empire under a single ruler was revived. It was a nostalgic nod to the days of the Roman Empire, a time when one man could hold sway over vast territories and diverse peoples. But this wasn't just about living out a Roman fantasy. It was a calculated move to solidify Charlemagne's control over his empire and legitimize his rule in the eyes of rival monarchs. However, the reality was far from the romantic ideal. The so-called Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of territories held together by a combination of military force, strategic marriages, and political alliances. It was less a cohesive empire and more a collection of fiefdoms with a common ruler. Charlemagne's challenge was to keep this sprawling entity from splintering into a dozen competing kingdoms. No small feat, considering the medieval penchant for rebellion and intrigue. Economically, the crowning also had its merits. Charlemagne's new title gave him the clout to negotiate trade agreements and secure alliances with other rulers. It was like getting an upgrade from business class to first class on the medieval political jet. His control over key trade routes, especially those connecting the North Sea with the Mediterranean, allowed him to orchestrate the flow of goods and wealth more effectively. In a world where power was measured in coin as much as in conquests, this was a critical advantage. But the crowning wasn't without its critics. Some saw it as an affront to the Byzantine Empire, which fancied itself the true heir to the Roman legacy. The Byzantines weren't exactly thrilled about a Western upstart claiming the imperial mantle. It's like suddenly finding out your neighbor has declared themselves the new HOA president without so much as a heads-up. Diplomatic tensions simmered, providing a taste of the East-West rivalries that would simmer for centuries. So, what does this all mean in the grand tapestry of history? Charlemagne's crowning as Holy Roman Emperor marked a turning point, a moment when the religious and political realms intertwined in a way that would shape the future of Europe. It was a bold statement that the secular and the sacred were two sides of the same coin, each reinforcing the other's authority. Yet, for all the grandeur and symbolism of the coronation, Charlemagne's reign as emperor was filled with as much turmoil as triumph. His legacy was one of ambition tempered by the harsh realities of medieval politics. The title of Holy Roman Emperor may have been a feather in his cap, but it also came with enough responsibilities to weigh down even the most ambitious ruler. As we leave Charlemagne basking in the glow of his imperial coronation, remember that this is just another chapter in his epic saga. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was a crown of thorns as much as it was a laurel wreath, and the challenges it brought would test the mettle of Charlemagne and his successors. So stay tuned, because this medieval roller coaster has plenty more twists and turns to offer. Charlemagne's crowning was just the beginning of an epic tale that would echo through the corridors of history long after he shuffled off this mortal coil. But as with all great stories, there's a twist that keeps things interesting. You see, on January 28, 814 AD, Charlemagne breathed his last in Aachen, the city that had become his favored seat of power. And with his death, the empire he painstakingly built began to unravel faster than a sweater caught on a nail. Let's not sugarcoat it. Charlemagne's empire was as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. Sure, it was grandiose and impressive, but it was also as fragile as a medieval truce. His vast realm was held together by the sheer force of his will and the strength of his sword arm, not to mention some clever politicking. But as any good strategist will tell you, once the linchpin is gone, the structure tends to collapse in on itself. And that's precisely what happened. In the flick of a quill, the empire was divided among Charlemagne's grandsons, thanks to the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD. Imagine the chaos of a medieval yard sale, with territories being divvied up like old furniture. The once mighty Carolingian Empire fragmented into three distinct kingdoms, East Francia, West Francia, and Middle Francia. It's like the empire was put through a medieval blender and set to chop. East Francia would eventually become the Holy Roman Empire, while West Francia laid the groundwork for modern France. As for Middle Francia, well, let's say it went through more identity crises than a teenage pop star. The division of the empire was a stark reminder of the transient nature of political power. Charlemagne's legacy, like a sandcastle at high tide, was at the mercy of the elements, and those elements were his own descendants. It was a classic case of too many cooks in the kitchen, each with their own recipe for power. The result? A smorgasbord of conflict, intrigue, and enough family drama to fill a medieval soap opera. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Charlemagne's legacy wasn't just about political fragmentation. His reign set the stage for the modern concept of Europe, a continent united by a shared cultural and historical heritage. His efforts to promote education and literacy laid the groundwork for the intellectual renaissances that would follow. Charlemagne wasn't just a conqueror, he was a catalyst for change, a man whose vision of a united Europe would inspire generations. Yet, for all his achievements, Charlemagne was also a man of contradictions. He was a warrior who advocated for education, a ruler who sought unity through conquest, and a king who wielded both the sword and the scepter with equal skill. His campaigns were as brutal as they were strategic, and his policies as visionary as they were ruthless. He was a product of his time, a medieval maestro conducting an orchestra of chaos and order. The myths and legends surrounding Charlemagne have only grown in the centuries since his death. From the epic tales of the Song of Roland to the romanticized accounts of his reign, Charlemagne has been cast as both hero and villain, saint and sinner. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. His story is a tapestry of fact and fiction, woven together by the hands of history. But why does Charlemagne's tale still resonate today? Perhaps it's because his story is a mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature. We see in Charlemagne a man who was both visionary and flawed, ambitious and fallible. His legacy is a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a narrative shaped by the choices and actions of those who came before us. In the end, Charlemagne's life and legacy are a testament to the enduring power of myth and memory. He was a man who dreamed of a united Europe, a vision that remains as relevant today as it was over a millennium ago. His story is a reminder that the past is never truly gone. It lingers in the echoes of our present, shaping the world we live in. So, as we close the book on Charlemagne, let us remember him not just as a ruler or a conqueror, but as a man whose impact transcended the boundaries of time and space. His legacy is a complex tapestry of myth and reality, a story that continues to captivate and inspire. And that, dear friends, is the real magic of history. In the swirling chaos of ancient China, where power was as elusive as a greased pig at a county fair, a boy named Yingzheng entered the scene in 259 BCE. Born in the state of Qin, his arrival wasn't exactly heralded by choirs of angels. His mother, Zhao Jai, was a concubine of King Xuanxiang of Qin, and if you think your family gatherings are awkward, try having your dad's marriage to your mom orchestrated by a merchant named Lu Bue, who had his own ambitions wrapped up in the whole affair. Talk about tangled webs. Yingzheng's early life wasn't exactly a stroll through the imperial gardens. Thanks to the political chess game his father was playing with the state of Zhao, young Ying found himself shipped off as a hostage. Yes, a hostage prince. That's an oxymoron if I ever heard one. His time in Zhao was less about princely pampering and more about surviving in the lion's den, surrounded by folks who weren't exactly thrilled about his family's power plays. It was like growing up in the enemy camp, with all the diplomatic niceties of a rock-throwing contest. Fast forward a few years, and Ying Zheng, still in his early teens, was thrust onto the throne of Qin in 246 BCE after his father's death. But let's be honest, ruling a state at the tender age of 13 is a bit like putting a toddler in charge of a candy store. Things are bound to get sticky. Thankfully, he had some help. Lu Bue, the same guy who played matchmaker with his parents, stepped in as regent. Lu wasn't exactly your kindly uncle type. He was more of a puppet master, pulling strings and trying to keep young Ying in line. But our boy Ying Zheng wasn't content to be a marionette. He had plans, big ones. By the time he turned 22, he kicked Lu Bue to the curb and took the reins himself. And when the dust settled, Ying Zheng wasn't just looking to rule Qin. Oh no, this guy had his eyes on the grand prize, unifying all of China, a feat that might have seemed as impossible as herding cats. But Ying Zheng was nothing if not ambitious. By 221 BCE, he'd done the seemingly impossible, unifying the warring states under Qin's banner. And just like that, Ying Zheng was no more. He transformed into Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, at the ripe age of 38. Now, if you think that's impressive, consider the fact that back then, the average life expectancy was around 35 years. Talk about an overachiever. Now, becoming the emperor is one thing. Keeping that title, that's a whole other kettle of fish. Qin Shi Huang wasn't exactly Mr. Congeniality. His policies were about as warm and cuddly as a porcupine in winter. He implemented strict legalist principles, which is a fancy way of saying he ruled with an iron fist and wasn't afraid to flex it. His methods included burning books and burying scholars alive, not exactly the stuff of a Disney movie. But in his quest for control, Qin Shi Huang did a few things that were undeniably ahead of their time. He standardized weights and measures, which might sound as dry as toast, but it revolutionized trade. He also standardized the Chinese script, which is like taking a country that speaks in 1,000 tongues and giving them one language to write it all down. It was a move that unified the empire in ways that went beyond borders. Then there was his little project of building roads and starting the construction of what would eventually become the Great Wall of China. He was thinking big, really big. But hey, when you're trying to keep out invaders and impress the neighbors, a massive wall seems like a logical, if not somewhat over-the-top, choice. Of course, no reign is without its hiccups, and Qin Shi Huang's were monumental. Early on, he had to deal with a couple of assassination attempts. One of the most famous involved an assassin named Jing Qi, who tried to off him with a map concealing a dagger. Spoiler, it didn't work, but it certainly added a bit of drama to the court scene. Qin Shi Huang's reign was a roller coaster of innovation and authoritarianism, a mix of visionary strokes and downright draconian laws. His quest for immortality, which we'll dive into later, was just the cherry on top of this imperial sundae. But for now, let's just say he was a man who knew how to make an entrance and an impact. Speaking of making an impact, let's talk about Qin Shi Huang's little construction project that aimed to keep the neighbors out and put his empire on the map, literally. The Great Wall of China, or at least the early version of it, was Qin Shi Huang's answer to the age-old problem of border security. Forget a white picket fence. He went for something a bit more substantial. But before you picture a seamless stone wall snaking over the horizon like some ancient Instagram influencer's dream, let's get one thing straight. This wall wasn't the polished tourist attraction we know today. In reality, the early wall was more of a rugged, ramshackle affair, cobbled together from whatever materials the local terrain provided. Think tamped earth, wood, and stone. It was built by hundreds of thousands of workers, many of whom were conscripted peasants, criminals, or prisoners of war. Yeah, let's just say they weren't exactly there on a volunteer basis. This workforce was tasked with constructing a barrier that stretched over 3,000 miles, which is like building a wall from New York to LA, with just a bit more back-breaking labor and a lot fewer coffee breaks. Now, the logistics of this project were as mind-boggling as they were brutal. The labor force was enormous, with some estimates suggesting as many as 300,000 workers were involved at any given time. These folks toiled under harsh conditions, and let's just say the health and safety regulations were, well, non-existent. The death toll was staggering, with tales of workers who perished being buried within the wall itself. This practice, while making for a spine-chilling myth, is more historical legend than fact. But it's easy to see why the story stuck. It's the kind of dark twist that makes history feel like a horror movie marathon. The cost of this monumental project was astronomical. We're talking a huge drain on the state's resources, both in terms of manpower and money. It took a serious chunk out of the empire's coffers, with funds that could have gone towards, I don't know, feeding people or boosting the economy. But hey, priorities, right? The wall wasn't just about keeping out the pesky nomadic tribes to the north. It was also a symbol of the emperor's might, and a way to keep his newly unified empire in check. After all, nothing says, "I've got this," like a massive wall stretching across the landscape. But Qin Shi Huang's ambitions didn't stop at construction. The man was obsessed with immortality, a quest that seemed about as achievable as finding a unicorn in your backyard. He poured his resources into finding the secret to eternal life, employing alchemists and magicians who peddled potions and elixirs like snake oil salesmen at a medieval fair. One popular remedy involved mercury, which, spoiler alert, is highly toxic. Despite its lethality, mercury was considered a key ingredient in the elixirs meant to grant eternal life. The irony here is thicker than a mercury-laden potion. The very substance intended to keep him alive likely contributed to his demise. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with living forever was more than just a personal quirk. It had real economic and social impacts. The search for immortality was costly, diverting resources from other, perhaps more practical endeavors. It also meant that the emperor was constantly surrounded by sycophants and charlatans eager to profit from his fears and delusions. The emperor's health was a state secret, and his eventual death in 210 BCE was shrouded in mystery and subterfuge. News of his passing was concealed for months, with officials going to bizarre lengths to keep up appearances. They reportedly carted his body around in a wagon filled with salted fish to mask the smell of decay during the journey back to the capital. Talk about a fishy situation. With his death, the grand plans and iron grip of Qin Shi Huang began to unravel, but not before he left an indelible mark on China's landscape and psyche. His reign, for all its harshness and ambition, set the stage for future dynasties, who would either build upon his foundations or learn cautionary tales from his excesses. While Qin Shi Huang didn't achieve immortality in the literal sense, his legacy has endured through the ages, a testament to the enduring power of a well-spun myth. As we continue our journey through his life and reign, we'll delve deeper into the ripple effects of his rule and the tumultuous times that followed. Stay tuned for more twists, turns, and tales from the annals of ancient China. With Qin Shi Huang's grand legacy in the making, let's jump into the nitty-gritty of his rule, where he took a hard-line approach that would make even the toughest school principal look like a teddy bear. Welcome to legalism. Folks, Qin Shi Huang's got a governance philosophy that made him the ultimate micromanager of the ancient world. Forget about ruling with a gentle hand. This was more like wielding a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. Legalism, for those of you taking notes, wasn't about cuddly concepts like virtue or moral persuasion. Nope, it was about strict laws, harsh punishments, and ensuring everyone knew who the boss was. Think of it as the ancient version of my way or the highway, except the highway might just involve a one-way trip to a labor camp. Under Qin Shi Huang, even the smallest infraction could land you in hot water. We're talking fines, forced labor, or even a one-way ticket to the afterlife for minor offenses. Jaywalking. Better hope you can outrun the imperial enforcers. Now, why all the doom and gloom? Simply put, Qin Shi Huang wanted to solidify his grip on power, and he wasn't about to let a little thing like public sentiment get in the way. In his view, the stick was mightier than the carrot, and he had a whole forest of sticks ready to go. His laws were designed to instill fear and obedience, ensuring that his newly unified empire stayed that way, unified and obedient. But here's the kicker. While these policies tightened his control, they also brewed a bubbling cauldron of resentment among the populace. It's like trying to keep a lid on a pot that's about to boil over. One of the most notorious aspects of Qin Shi Huang's rule was his infamous book burning and the execution of scholars. Picture this. The emperor, in his quest for absolute control, decided that the only good book was one that didn't challenge his authority. So, in 213 BCE, he ordered the mass burning of texts that didn't align with his legalist philosophy. Confucian classics, historical records, and other philosophical works went up in smoke. It was like the original cancel culture, but with actual flames. Now, let's clear the air on a popular myth, the idea that Qin Shi Huang buried 460 scholars alive. It's a story that's been passed down through the ages, but the truth is likely less dramatic. While there were executions, it's more probable that the scholars were executed in a more conventional, if still horrifying manner. The tale of being buried alive makes for a chilling narrative, but it's a classic example of how history can twist reality into something that fits the drama of folklore. This cultural purge wasn't just about control, it was also about shaping the narrative. By eliminating dissenting voices and alternative philosophies, Qin Shi Huang aimed to create a singular, unified way of thinking that aligned with his vision of the empire. It was a PR campaign with a body count, and it ensured that the emperor's ideology would echo through the ages. But as with many things Qin Shi Huang touched, the immediate results were mixed. While he managed to stifle opposition, he also stoked the fires of discontent that would eventually contribute to his dynasty's downfall. The economic context of these reforms is worth a closer look. Running an empire isn't cheap, and Qin Shi Huang's policies had a way of both filling and draining the imperial coffers. On one hand, his standardized systems, like currency, weights, and measures, helped streamline trade and improve efficiency across his vast territories. These reforms were like ancient China's version of hitting the economic refresh button, and they played a crucial role in stabilizing the empire's economy. On the other hand, the emperor's penchant for grandiose projects, combined with his punitive legal system, placed a hefty burden on the populace. Taxes were high, labor conscription was common, and the average citizen often found themselves caught in the crosshairs of the emperor's ambitious plans. It's a bit like being the middle child in a family where everything revolves around the eldest sibling's success. Except in this case, the sibling was a monumental empire-building agenda, and the family was the entire Qin populace. The social and political factors at play during Qin Shi Huang's reign are a study in contrasts. On the surface, the emperor's policies were designed to create a strong, centralized state with him at the helm. But beneath that veneer of unity, there was a simmering unrest that threatened to bubble over. While the emperor's harsh laws kept the peace through fear, they also sowed the seeds of rebellion among those who chafed under his iron rule. Qin Shi Huang's reign was nothing if not a lesson in extremes. He achieved remarkable feats of unification and standardization, laying the groundwork for a united China that would outlast his own dynasty. But his methods, harsh, uncompromising, and often brutal, left a legacy as complex as the man himself. His story is a cautionary tale of how power, when wielded without checks or balances, can lead to both greatness and downfall. As we delve further into the life and times of Qin Shi Huang, Remember that the Emperor's story is far from over. His quest for immortality, his monumental projects, and the eventual unraveling of his empire are tales yet to be told. The man who unified China with an iron fist left behind a legacy that continues to echo through the corridors of history, a testament to the enduring power of ambition and its double-edged sword. Stay tuned for more insights and intrigues from the reign of China's first emperor, where the myths are just as compelling as the realities they conceal. As we unpack the enigma of Qin Shi Huang, let's pivot to the clandestine corridors of his personal life, more like a soap opera, but with fewer commercial breaks and a lot more intrigue. The emperor's relationships were as tangled as a bowl of ancient noodles, a mix of verified facts and juicy rumors that have kept historians guessing for centuries. Take his mother, Zhao Jai, for instance, wasn't just a footnote in his biography, but a complex character in her own right. Her relationship with Lu Biwei, the enterprising merchant who had a knack for matchmaking with political perks, was a head-scratcher. Some say Lu was more than just a kingmaker. He might have been Qin Shi Huang's biological father. Talk about a plot twist that would have made Maury Povich reach for the DNA test kit. Now, let's dive into the Emperor's romantic escapades, or rather, the lack thereof. Despite the power and wealth at his disposal, Qin Shi Huang's love life was about as lively as a stone statue. There's little evidence of a significant empress or consort playing a prominent role beside him. While his court was undoubtedly filled with ladies-in-waiting, his personal connections seemed to pale in comparison to his ambition for an everlasting empire. Maybe he was too busy chasing immortality to chase romance. Speaking of immortality, his obsession with it was practically a family affair. Qin Shi Huang was surrounded by a cadre of alchemists and so-called immortality experts, all peddling elixirs that promised eternal life. It's like the ancient version of a late-night infomercial, except with a bit more poison. These concoctions often contained mercury, which, as we know today, is better suited for thermometers than for sipping by the fireside. Ironically, his quest for eternal life might have hastened his demise, a bitter pill to swallow, quite literally. But paranoia, rather than love, was the real emotion that ruled Qin Shi Huang's later years. The emperor was convinced that enemies were lurking around every corner, which wasn't entirely unfounded given his ruthless rise to power. His fear of assassination was so intense that he constructed a sprawling network of secret tunnels and passageways beneath his palaces. Think of it as the ancient world's version of an underground bunker, except without the canned beans and emergency radio. This subterranean labyrinth allowed him to move undetected, a necessity in a court filled with more plots than a mystery novel. The emperor's paranoia was almost legendary, and it fed into his relentless pursuit of control. He went as far as having multiple identical palaces built across his empire, a move designed to confuse would-be assassins about his true whereabouts. It's a bit like playing hide and seek, but with an empire at stake. And let's not forget the infamous Terracotta Army, unearthed centuries later in 1974. This 8,000-strong legion of clay soldiers wasn't just a testament to Qin Shi Huang's grandiose vision. It was his insurance policy for the afterlife. He believed that these life-sized warriors would protect him in death, as his real army did in life. It's a strategy that screams, "I'm taking it all with me," and it's one of the most extravagant burial plans history has ever recorded. As Qin Shi Huang's paranoia grew, so did the internal tensions within his empire. His iron-fisted rule kept the peace, but at a steep price. The populace bore the brunt of his ambitious projects through heavy taxes and forced labor. The empire was a tightly wound spring, and the pressure was palpable. It's a classic case of a ruler so focused on external threats and immortality that he overlooked the very real discontent simmering under his nose. In his later years, the emperor embarked on numerous inspection tours across his empire, perhaps as a way to physically assert his dominance over the lands he had unified. These tours were no small feat, requiring a massive entourage and elaborate logistical planning. But despite, or perhaps because of, these grand displays of power, Qin Shi Huang's life was tinged with a profound sense of isolation. He had made himself untouchable, both literally and figuratively. The emperor's final days remained shrouded in as much mystery as his life. After ingesting yet another mercury-laden elixir, his health rapidly declined. in 210 BCE. During one of his inspection tours, he met his end. But in a move worthy of a spy thriller, his death was kept secret for months. Officials feared the potential chaos that could follow such a monumental announcement. They disguised the smell of his decaying body with salted fish, maintaining the illusion of a living emperor just a little longer. It was a macabre charade, a fitting end to a reign marked by both grandeur and paranoia. Qin Shi Huang's story, like the man himself, is one of contrasts. He was a ruler who sought to leave an indelible mark on history, and that he did. But his legacy is as much about what he built as what he destroyed. His reign set the stage for a unified China, yet it also illuminated the perils of unchecked power and the human cost of ambition. So, as we wrap up our peek into the personal and internal dynamics of his empire, remember, the full story of Qin Shi Huang is still unfolding. Stay tuned for the fallout of his death and the tumultuous times that followed. With the grand puppet master himself now gone, the stage was set for the unraveling of the Qin dynasty, a dynastic speedrun that would make even the most chaotic reality show look like a knitting circle. Qin Shi Huang's meticulously woven tapestry of power and control began to fray the moment his imperial cloak hit the floor. His death in 210 BCE wasn't just the end of a reign. It was the starting gun for a race to chaos. Let's talk succession. Qin Shi Huang, the guy obsessed with eternal life, hadn't exactly excelled at planning for a posthumous handoff. It's like he was convinced he'd live forever. Insurance policy be damned. His first son, Fusu, was the heir apparent, but the emperor's death was concealed long enough for a palace coup to simmer. Enter Zhao Gao, a high-ranking eunuch with Machiavellian ambitions and the subtlety of a bull in a china shop, partnered with Lai Si, the chancellor, and together they decided that Fusu was too much of a goody-two-shoes to keep up the harsh legalist regime. So they cooked up a plan to install the more pliable and considerably less competent younger son, Huang, as the new emperor, Qin Shi. Zhao Gao sent a forged letter to Fusu, encouraging him to off himself, and shockingly, Fusu obliged. With such a weak-willed heir out of the way, Huang took the throne. Surprise, surprise. The new emperor's reign wasn't exactly a masterclass in governance. The Qin dynasty, for all its standardized measures and vast armies, couldn't standardize common sense or loyalty among its leaders. Huang's reign was marked by internal strife, as Zhao Gao pulled the strings behind the scenes. It's a classic tale of power gone unchecked, with a side of betrayal and backstabbing that would give even Game of Thrones a run for its money. The immediate fallout of Qin Shi Huang's policies reared its ugly head as soon as the iron grip of his rule relaxed. Those grandiose projects and draconian laws that seemed like a good idea at the time, they left a bit of a sour taste. The populace, weary of heavy taxation and forced labor, was primed for rebellion. And that's exactly what happened. In no time, rebellions broke out across the empire like a rash after a bad meal. The most notable among them was led by Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, two former peasants turned insurgents who must have thought, if we can't beat em, let's beat em up. These uprisings were fueled by widespread discontent and the brutal realities of life under the Qin. The empire's harsh legalism had kept people in line, but the second that iron grip loosened, the desire for change erupted like a volcano. The rebels found fertile ground in the hearts of those who had lost sons and fathers to the emperor's endless building projects. It's a reminder that while you can build a wall to keep enemies out, you can't wall in people's discontent. By 206 BCE, just 4 years after Qin Shi Huang's death, the dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own ambition and the incompetence of its rulers. The last emperor, Qin Shi, was deposed, and Zhao Gao was finally taken down in a classic case of getting hoisted by his own petard. The Qin dynasty, which had unified China with such force and fervor, fell apart faster than you can say terracotta. But even in its downfall, the dynasty left an indelible mark that would shape the future of China. So, what about Qin Shi Huang's legacy? Here's where it gets interesting. On one hand, he was a visionary, a man who dared to dream big and reimagine an entire continent under one rule. The standardization of currency, weights and measures, and the unification of written script were strokes of genius that made communication and trade across vast distances not just possible but efficient. These achievements laid the groundwork for a cohesive Chinese identity that continues to be felt in modern China. On the flip side, his reign is a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked power and the human cost of authoritarianism. His quest for immortality, while fascinating, serves as a stark reminder that no amount of power or wealth can stave off the inevitable. And his harsh legalist policies, while effective in the short term, ultimately sowed the seeds of his dynasty's downfall by alienating the very people he needed to maintain his empire. Today, Qin Shi Huang is both reviled and revered. He's the man who unified China and created a centralized state, but he's also a symbol of tyranny and excess. His mausoleum, guarded by the silent clay sentinels of the terracotta army, stands as a testament to his ambition and his desire to control his narrative even in death. It's a legacy that's as complex as the man himself, a blend of awe-inspiring achievements and cautionary tales. In modern China, echoes of Qin Shi Huang's vision can still be felt. The Great Wall, although significantly rebuilt, remains a symbol of China's strength and resilience. The unification and centralization he championed continue to influence Chinese politics and governance. Yet, his story also serves as a reminder of the importance of balance and the dangers of a ruler who wields too much power without accountability. As we wrap up this whirlwind tour of Qin Shi Huang's life and legacy, let's leave with one final thought. History, much like life, is messy and full of contradictions. Qin Shi Huang's story is a reminder that even the most powerful rulers are human, with all the complexities and flaws that come with it. His legacy is a testament to the enduring power of ambition and the double-edged sword that it can be. So, as you drift off to sleep with visions of ancient China dancing in your head, remember that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a tapestry woven from the stories of those who dared to dream big and sometimes paid the price. Ever heard of a math genius who managed to shake up the entire intellectual world of 4th century Egypt while cruising around in a chariot like she owned the place? Meet Hypatia of Alexandria. Now, Alexandria wasn't just any city back then. It was a vibrant hub of scholarly activity, kind of like the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, but with more togas and fewer overpriced coffee shops. The year was somewhere around 360 AD, and the Roman Empire was having a bit of an identity crisis, caught between its pagan past and a future increasingly dominated by Christianity. Hypatia was born into this delightful chaos, and boy, did she seize the moment. Her father, Huang, was no slouch himself. He was a renowned mathematician and philosopher, the kind of guy who probably gave the phrase, dad jokes, a whole new level of intellectual flair. He worked at the Museum of Alexandria, which, contrary to what you might think, wasn't just a museum. It was more like a university, library, and think tank all rolled into one. Imagine Hogwarts, but with more scrolls and less magic. From a young age, Hypatia was enveloped in this intellectual atmosphere. She wasn't just dipping her toes into the pool of knowledge. She dove in head first. Huang taught her everything he knew about mathematics and philosophy, and Hypatia, being the prodigy she was, soaked it all up like a sponge. She had the kind of mind that could make Euclid's Elements sound like a page-turner. By the time she hit her stride, she was not just her father's daughter, but a formidable scholar in her own right. Now, let's talk about the big pink elephant in the room. The fact that Hypatia was a woman doing all this in a time when women were expected to be, well, not doing any of this. Think about it. Most women of her era were busy with domestic tasks, thanks to the prevailing barefoot and pregnant doctrine. But Hypatia, she was out there solving complex equations and philosophizing about the cosmos. She wasn't just breaking the glass ceiling, she was obliterating it with a catapult. Her reputation as a mathematician and philosopher spread like wildfire. People flocked to her lectures, and she soon became the toast of Alexandria. With her knack for clear explanations and engaging teaching style, Hypatia transformed complicated ideas into digestible bites. Her lectures were so popular that scholars from all over the Roman Empire would pack their bags and make the trek to Alexandria just to hear her speak. She was a rock star of the academic world, and her fans were just as devoted. And then there was her chariot. Yes, you heard that right. Hypatia had her own chariot. While most of us today are happy to get from point A to point B without hitting too many potholes, Hypatia was turning heads as she rode through the streets of Alexandria. It wasn't just a mode of transportation, it was a statement. It said, "I'm here, I'm brilliant, and I have places to be." But before we get too swept away by this rather glamorous image, let's not forget the gritty realities of the time. Alexandria in the 4th century was a hotbed of political tension and religious upheaval. The Romans were trying to keep a lid on things, while various factions were vying for control. It wasn't all scrolls and sunshine. The city was a powder keg, ready to blow at any minute. And yet, in the midst of all this, Hypatia managed to carve out a space for herself, not just as a scholar, but as a symbol of intellectual freedom. So, how did she do it? How did Hypatia, with all the odds stacked against her, become one of the most influential figures of her time? Well, it wasn't just by being smart, although that certainly helped. It was by being audacious, by refusing to let societal norms dictate her path. She didn't just talk the talk, she rode the chariot ride, all while making Pythagoras look like an amateur. In the world of Hypatia, intellectual curiosity was the ultimate power. She was living proof that knowledge was not just a man's game, and she did it all with a flair that would make any modern influencer jealous. But stay tuned, because her story is just getting started, and trust me, it's a roller coaster you won't want to miss. But before we leap onto the next chapter of Hypatia's intellectual roller coaster, let's zoom in on her playground, the Library of Alexandria. Picture this, a massive repository of scrolls and books, the kind of place that'd make even the most seasoned bibliophile weep with joy. It wasn't just a library, it was the Google of its time, minus the targeted ads. And Hypatia was right at the center of it, like a kid in a candy store where the candies are ancient texts on everything from geometry to the stars. Now, let's talk numbers for a minute. The Library of Alexandria was said to house anywhere from 40,000 to 400,000 scrolls. Yeah, that's a pretty big range, but historians can't exactly whip out a time machine to do a head count. The point is, this was a treasure trove of knowledge, and Hypatia was one of its most prized intellectual gems. She'd sift through these scrolls, pulling out nuggets of wisdom and crafting them into lectures that were the TED talks of antiquity. Hypatia's contributions to mathematics and astronomy were nothing short of groundbreaking. She didn't just accept the knowledge handed down to her. She questioned it, refined it, and sometimes downright reinvented it. Take, for example, her work on conic sections. If you ever found yourself dozing off in high school geometry, you might remember these as the curves you get by slicing a cone at different angles. Circles, ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas. Boring? Maybe. But for Hypatia, they were the building blocks of a new understanding of the universe. She expanded on the work of Apollonius of Perga, making it more accessible and applicable. In doing so, she laid the groundwork for future mathematicians and astronomers, effectively bridging the gap between the ancients and the Renaissance thinkers who would later pick up her torch. And let's not forget about her innovation with the astrolabe, the ancient equivalent of a GPS for the stars. The astrolabe was already a marvel of engineering, used by astronomers to solve problems related to time and the position of celestial objects. Hypatia didn't invent it, but she certainly improved it, refining its accuracy and making it more user-friendly. She was like the Steve Jobs of her time, taking existing technology and making it sleek and efficient. But Hypatia's influence wasn't confined to the dusty scrolls of the library or the polished metal of an astrolabe. Her true genius lay in her ability to teach. She was to ancient academia what rock stars are to music, charismatic, brilliant, and a magnet for talent. Students from across the Mediterranean flocked to Alexandria, eager to soak up her wisdom. Imagine the scene, a diverse group of eager minds, gathered in a lecture hall, hanging on her every word as she unraveled the mysteries of the cosmos. She had a knack for making complex ideas not just understandable, but downright enthralling. And unlike your typical ancient scholar, she wasn't hoarding knowledge like some intellectual dragon guarding its hoard. No, she was all about sharing the wealth. One of her teaching methods was to encourage a rational, evidence-based approach to learning. In a time where myths and superstition often overshadowed facts, Hypatia was all about evidence. She was basically the ancient world's equivalent of a peer review committee, pushing her students to question assumptions and back up their arguments with data. You can almost hear her saying, "Please, for the love of Zeus, cite your sources." Her reputation as a teacher spread far and wide, and soon Hypatia wasn't just a local celebrity. She was an international icon. Students who studied under her carried her teachings back to their homelands, spreading her influence across borders. This wasn't just about math and astronomy. It was about fostering a culture of inquiry and critical thinking that would leave a lasting legacy long after her chariot had rolled into the sunset. But before we get too caught up in this idyllic vision of ancient academia, let's not forget the political and social context in which Hypatia operated. The Roman Empire was a hot mess of competing interests, and Alexandria was no exception. The city was a melting pot of cultures, religions, and political factions, each vying for dominance. Hypatia navigated this turbulent landscape with the skill of a seasoned diplomat, but it wasn't without its challenges. Her commitment to intellectual freedom and rational inquiry put her at odds with the rising tide of religious conservatism, which viewed her teachings with suspicion and heresy. Despite these challenges, Hypatia remained a steadfast advocate for knowledge and reason. She was the embodiment of intellectual courage, standing firm in her beliefs even as the world around her seemed to be crumbling. Her story is a testament to the power of ideas and the indomitable spirit of those who dare to challenge the status quo. So there you have it, Hypatia, the rock star of ancient academia, shaking up the world one lecture at a time. But this is far from the end of her story. There are more twists and turns to come, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Stay tuned, because what happens next is the stuff of legend. And legend, as we know, is just history with a little extra flair. As we dive back into the bustling metropolis of Alexandria, let's not forget that this was a city where political intrigue was practically a spectator sport. Imagine Game of Thrones, but with more sandals and slightly fewer dragons. At the heart of this tangled web of alliances and rivalries was Orst, the Roman prefect, a man who could probably write a book called How to Juggle Political Factions Without Losing Your Head. And into this mix, like a mathematical prodigy at a toga party, stepped Hypatia. Orst was no fool. He recognized Hypatia's intellectual heft and saw her as a valuable ally. After all, when you're trying to keep a city from tearing itself apart, having a philosopher-mathematician in your corner isn't the worst strategy. Hypatia's salon became a neutral ground where political and intellectual minds could meet, debate, and hopefully not resort to throwing papyrus wads at one another. Her influence extended beyond the classroom. She was essentially the ancient world's version of a think tank, minus the PowerPoint presentations. But let's not sugarcoat things. Alexandria was a hotbed of religious tension, a city where the Christian and pagan factions were about as friendly as cats and water. Hypatia, with her devotion to science and reason, was caught in the middle of this storm. Her friendship with Orst, a pagan sympathizer, certainly didn't win her any brownie points with Cyril, the Bishop of Alexandria. If you think office politics are bad, try navigating a situation where theological disputes could literally end with someone getting stoned. And not in the mellow, 1960s way. Now, let's tackle one of the more colorful myths about Hypatia, the whole witchcraft thing. Here's a woman who spent her days teaching Euclidean geometry and improving the astrolabe, but some folks back then figured, hey, she's a woman with a brain, must be a sorceress. It's almost laughable until you remember the grim reality that such accusations could be deadly. Hypatia was no more a witch than your local librarian is a wizard. The real magic she practiced was the kind that turned ignorance into enlightenment, and some people just couldn't handle that kind of sorcery. As the city's political tensions escalated, Hypatia's role as an advisor and mediator became increasingly precarious. She was a beacon of rationality in a time when rationality was about as popular as unsweetened oatmeal. Her public discussions, valued for their insight, also made her a target. In the eyes of her detractors, she was an antagonist to the divine order, a notion that seems as absurd as blaming gravity for making things fall. The economic context of Alexandria also played a crucial role in this brewing conflict. The city was economically vital, a key trading hub where goods, ideas, and occasionally fists were exchanged. Orst, with Hypatia's counsel, was trying to maintain this delicate balance. But as with any good tragedy, the forces of upheaval were gathering momentum. In a city where the next riot was just a poorly timed sermon away, Orst needed all the allies he could muster. It's essential to understand that Hypatia wasn't just a pawn in these political games. She wielded significant influence, not through force, but through knowledge, a concept as foreign to some of her contemporaries as using a smartphone to a time traveler from 400 AD. Her ability to transcend the petty squabbles that dominated the political landscape made her both revered and reviled. She was a symbol of intellectual freedom, a testament to the power of the mind, even in the face of overwhelming ignorance. And speaking of ignorance, let's not forget the role of misinformation. The rumors and slander that spread about Hypatia were the ancient equivalent of Twitter trolls, minus the hashtag. Her detractors painted her as a pagan conspirator, a narrative that found fertile ground in a city rife with suspicion and fear. In reality, her allegiance was to knowledge, not to any single religious or political entity. She was the Switzerland of scholars, neutral, except when it came to the pursuit of truth. Despite these challenges, Hypatia's commitment to her ideals never wavered. She continued to teach, to inspire, and to challenge the status quo. Her courage in the face of mounting adversity was nothing short of heroic. But as the political climate in Alexandria grew more volatile, her very presence became a lightning rod for conflict. It was as if the city couldn't decide whether to celebrate her brilliance or condemn it. In a world where enlightenment was often overshadowed by dogma, Hypatia stood as a testament to the enduring power of reason. What makes Hypatia's story so compelling is not just her genius, but her resilience. She was a woman ahead of her time, living in an era that often seemed determined to drag her back into the dark. Her legacy isn't just about the equations she solved or the devices she improved. It's about the spirit of inquiry she embodied, a spirit that refused to be extinguished even in the face of overwhelming odds. As we leave Alexandria for now, remember that Hypatia's story isn't finished. The tensions that simmered during her lifetime would soon reach a boiling point, and her role in these events would become a defining moment in history. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in Hypatia's life is one you won't want to miss. It's a tale of courage, conflict, and a legacy that would echo through the ages. So, buckle up as we dive into the swirling vortex of political and religious tension in Alexandria, a world where Hypatia, the intellectual icon, found herself caught in a deadly tempest. It's 415 AD, and the city is like a powder keg with a short fuse. Think of it as a real-life episode of Survivor, but with a lot more theology and significantly fewer immunity idols. Hypatia had always been a beacon of knowledge and reason, a lighthouse guiding ships through the fog of ignorance. But even lighthouses can be battered by storms, and Alexandria was bracing for a hurricane. The socio-political landscape was as stable as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Orsts, the Roman prefect, was trying to keep the peace, but with religious factions more divided than a Thanksgiving dinner at a dysfunctional family reunion, it was no easy task. Orst's alliance with Hypatia was both a boon and a burden. Her intellectual clout lent him credibility, but it also made them both targets. Bishop Cyril, a man who probably had "doesn't play well with others" written on his report card, was not a fan. He viewed Hypatia's influence over Orst's as a threat to his own power. Cyril, the shrewd political player he was, saw an opportunity to consolidate his influence by turning public sentiment against this woman who dared to challenge the status quo. Enter the mob mentality, the ancient version of social media pylon, where facts are as scarce as a snowstorm in the Sahara. Fueled by rumors and religious fervor, the crowd was whipped into a frenzy. Cyril's followers were convinced, or convinced themselves, that Hypatia was the root of their woes. Forget rational discourse. This was about finding a scapegoat, and Hypatia, with her pagan associations and intellectual independence, fit the bill. Now, let's pause to debunk the romanticized imagery that often surrounds Hypatia's death. Legend paints her as a martyr, torn apart by a mob, while nobly defending reason against superstition. The reality, as is often the case, is far more brutal and less cinematic. Hypatia was indeed murdered by a Christian mob, but it wasn't a grandiose standoff against ignorance. It was a vicious, calculated act, an execution of political expediency masked as religious righteousness. The streets of Alexandria were a cauldron of chaos. On a day that seemed like any other, Hypatia was attacked by a group of zealots led by a lector named Peter. They dragged her from her chariot. Yes, the same chariot that had once been a symbol of her freedom and independence, and into a church. There, she was stripped, beaten, and brutally murdered. Her body was dismembered, and her remains were burned. It was an act as savage as it was symbolic, a grim reminder of how fear and ignorance can turn a crowd into a weapon. Hypatia's murder was not merely the tragic end of a brilliant mind. It was a stark illustration of the dangers faced by those who dared to stand apart. She was a woman too brilliant, too independent for the comfort of her contemporaries. Her life was a testament to the power of intellect, but her death underscored the perils of being a woman who defied the limitations imposed by a male-dominated society. In a world where silence was golden, Hypatia's voice rang too loud for some to bear. The irony, of course, is palpable. Hypatia had spent her life rising above the petty squabbles and simplistic binaries of her time, only to be consumed by them. She was a victim of the very politics she had tried to transcend, a casualty in a conflict where power, not truth, was the ultimate currency. Her murder marked a turning point, a bleak chapter in the history of Alexandria that highlighted the fragility of reason in the face of fanaticism. The economic and social context played a crucial role in this tragedy. Alexandria was a city on edge, its prosperity undermined by internal strife and external pressures. The Christians were gaining political traction, and Cyril was determined to consolidate this power, even if it meant resorting to violence. Hypatia's death was a grim reflection of a city tearing itself apart from the inside, where the pursuit of knowledge took a backseat to religious dominance. But let's not romanticize the aftermath either. Hypatia's death didn't spark a revolution or usher in an age of enlightenment. The city continued its descent into turmoil, and the forces of ignorance and intolerance gained ground. It was a loss not just of a brilliant scholar, but of the potential for a society where ideas could be exchanged freely, where knowledge could flourish without fear of retribution. Still, Hypatia's legacy endures, a testament to the resilience of ideas even when their champions fall. Her story, though tragic, continues to inspire those who value the pursuit of truth over the comfort of dogma. She remains a symbol of intellectual courage, a reminder that while the quest for knowledge can be fraught with peril, it is a journey worth undertaking. As we leave the tumultuous streets of Alexandria, the tale of Hypatia's life and death remains a poignant reminder of the power and peril of challenging the status quo. Her impact echoes through the ages, a beacon for those who dare to think differently. And while her story has reached a tragic crescendo, the reverberations of her legacy continue to shape the narrative of history. Stay with us, because there's more to uncover in the saga of those who dared to follow in her footsteps. And so, as we step away from the chaos of Alexandria, we're left with Hypatia's legacy, one that's as intricate as the geometry she loved. Now, if you think her story ends with a few burnt scrolls and some ancient gossip, think again. Hypatia's impact stretched far beyond the dusty streets of her home city. Her life and work sent ripples through time, influencing everything from the Renaissance's intellectual rebirth to the modern feminist movement. Let's start with the Renaissance, that glorious age when Europe collectively decided it was tired of the Dark Ages' dim lighting and wanted to turn the intellectual lights back on. The thinkers of this period were all about reviving classical knowledge, and Hypatia's contributions were like catnip to these scholars. Her work on conic sections and the astrolabe, not to mention her philosophical musings, found a new audience among the likes of Copernicus and Galileo. These Renaissance luminaries stood on the shoulders of giants, and Hypatia was definitely in the lineup. Her influence made it across centuries and continents, a testament to the fact that you can kill a person, but good ideas, they're a bit harder to snuff out. Hypatia's life also became a touchstone for those fighting for gender equality. In the tapestry of history, she stands out as a vibrant thread, weaving through the feminist narrative. Imagine being a woman in a world where your best career option was patrician's wife, and then hearing about Hypatia, who was out there solving equations and teaching dudes about the stars. Talk about a role model. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and you see her name popping up in suffrage movements and feminist literature. She became a symbol of what women could achieve when the societal shackles were off. In fact, you could say she was the ancient world's version of a glass ceiling smasher, minus the hashtag activism, of course. But Hypatia's story is also a cautionary tale. It's a grim reminder of what happens when ignorance and fanaticism are allowed to run rampant. Her murder wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a societal failure. It highlighted the perils of allowing fear to dictate actions, of letting dogma overshadow reason. Even today, we see parallels in the ongoing struggle to balance intellect and politics. The clash between knowledge and power continues to play out in boardrooms and classrooms worldwide. Hypatia's story is a reminder that progress requires vigilance, that the light of reason must be protected against the shadows of fanaticism. And let's not forget the economic backdrop of Hypatia's time. Alexandria was a vital trading hub, the Silk Road's Mediterranean terminus. Its prosperity was a double-edged sword, attracting scholars and merchants, but also greed and corruption. The city's wealth was a tempting prize for power-hungry factions, a fact not lost on Cyril and his followers. Hypatia's murder, in part, was a bid to control the narrative, to consolidate power in a city where commerce and ideology were often at odds. It's a stark reminder that economic factors play a crucial role in shaping historical events, even when the story seems purely intellectual or ideological. The beauty of history is its complexity, its refusal to be neatly boxed into good and bad or right and wrong. Hypatia's life, with all its brilliance and tragedy, exemplifies this. She was a pioneer, a martyr, a scholar, and a teacher. Her legacy is both a beacon of inspiration and a warning against complacency. In the end, Hypatia reminds us that while the world has changed, the challenges of balancing intellect and politics remain as relevant as they were in the bustling streets of ancient Alexandria. So there you have it, Hypatia of Alexandria, a woman whose life story outlived the flames that tried to extinguish it. As we reflect on her enduring legacy, let's keep her spirit of inquiry alive, challenging assumptions and questioning the status quo. After all, while history might not repeat itself, it certainly rhymes, and Hypatia's tale is one worth keeping in tune. In the bustling heart of ancient Greece, where marble columns reached skyward and philosophers pondered the universe's secrets, life for women was anything but the stuff of epic poetry. Forget the glamorous toga parties and intellectual salons. The reality was more grit than glamour. Let's dive into the ordinary, where the scent of olive oil mingled with the clamor of daily chores. In Athens, women were the backbone of the household, but don't mistake that for power. They were the queens of domesticity, masters of spinning wool and weaving, which meant they spent a lot of time indoors. And by indoors, I mean in the women's quarters, a nifty feature of Greek homes that kept them conveniently out of sight. If the ancient Athenians had invented reality TV, women would have been the stars of Real Housewives of the Gynaeceum. Their wardrobe. Well, don't expect high fashion. The peplos and chiton were their go-to outfits. Think of them as ancient Greek yoga pants, practical, comfortable, and perfect for a day of household management. Food was simple but essential. Bread, olives, figs, and a splash of wine if you were feeling particularly festive. Meat was more of a luxury, reserved for special occasions or sacrificial ceremonies, where they'd rather feed the gods and their priests than the everyday citizen. Dining wasn't a social event. Women often ate separately from men, which, considering the conversation topics of the time, might have been a blessing in disguise. While Athenian women were busy weaving the fabric of society, literally, their Spartan counterparts were flexing their muscles. Spartan women had a reputation that would make even the toughest CrossFit enthusiast break a sweat. They were expected to be physically fit, not for Instagram likes, but to ensure they could birth strong warriors. You see, in Sparta, the division of labor was a bit different. While the men were off perfecting their war cries and spear throws, women were managing the estates, raising the next generation of soldiers, and even owning land, a shocking concept for the rest of Greece. Now, if you're picturing Spartan women as ancient Amazons, you wouldn't be too far off. They trained in sports, ran races, and even wrestled. Plato himself marveled at their strength and independence, though he likely scribbled those notes from a safe distance. This physical prowess wasn't just for show. It was a matter of national pride and duty. In a society that valued military excellence above all, producing strong offspring was a woman's patriotic contribution. The laws and customs governing women's lives were a mixed bag of the bizarre and the oppressive. In Athens, citizenship, and thus any semblance of legal identity, was for men only. Women were legally minors, forever under the care of a male guardian, whether a father, husband, or even a son. Marriage contracts were business transactions, with dowries acting as the ancient equivalent of a prenuptial agreement. Love. That was a nice idea, but not necessary. The aim was to produce legitimate heirs to inherit property and continue the family line. Contrast this with Sparta, where women had more freedom than their Athenian sisters, but let's not get carried away with notions of gender equality. Spartan women's relative autonomy was tied directly to the state's military needs. The famous phrase, "Come back with your shield or on it," wasn't just a motto for men. It was a reminder for women to raise warriors. Spartan women could inherit property and manage estates, a necessity since their husbands were frequently away at war. But this freedom came with strings attached, those of duty and expectation. In terms of fun, let's just say ancient Greek women weren't exactly hitting the hardest clubs. Religious festivals offered a rare chance to step into the public sphere. The Thesmophoria, a festival dedicated to Demeter, goddess of the harvest, was one such occasion. Women, for a few days, left their domestic confines and gathered to celebrate fertility and agriculture, a respite from their usual routines, and one of the few times their voices could be heard in a collective shout. But let's not romanticize these gatherings. The Thesmophoria involved rituals that were far from the stuff of holiday postcards. Think fasting, sacrifices, and some mysterious rites that remain, well, mysterious, likely for good reason. It was a break from the norm, yes, but also a reminder of their roles as life-givers and caretakers of the hearth and home. For all their differences, Athenian and Spartan women shared a common thread. Their roles were shaped by the needs and values of their respective city-states. In Athens, democracy was the word of the day, but don't let that fool you into thinking it extended beyond menfolk. Women were the unseen workforce behind the scenes, ensuring that the family, and by extension the city, functioned smoothly. Sparta, on the other hand, was a warrior society, and women were vital cogs in the military machine, tasked with producing and raising the next generation of soldiers. Eyebrow-raising laws weren't just a quirky side note. They were foundational to maintaining the social order. Take the Athenian rule that allowed a man to divorce his wife simply by declaring it in front of witnesses, no paperwork necessary. If a woman had grounds for divorce, however, she needed to petition a magistrate. And if you're wondering how often that worked out in her favor, let's just say it wasn't exactly a fair fight. These customs and laws might make modern sensibilities cringe, but they highlight a world where power dynamics were rigid and heavily skewed. While men debated philosophy and politics in the agora, women were negotiating the daily labyrinth of societal expectations. It wasn't all doom and gloom, though. Within these constraints, women carved out spaces of influence and agency, however limited. So, while the Parthenon stood as a beacon of Athenian achievement, and Spartan soldiers marched in perfect unison, the women of ancient Greece were weaving a quieter, yet no less crucial, tapestry. In the shadows of history's grand narratives, they lived, worked, and shaped the world in ways that the records often overlook. The day-to-day life of an ancient Greek woman might not make it into the epic tales, but it was the heartbeat of a civilization, pulsing beneath the surface of marble and myth. Now, let's peel back the layers of ancient Greece and take a deeper plunge into the political and economic spheres where women, for the most part, played supporting roles. Picture a theatrical production where women were behind-the-scenes crew, while men strutted the stage. But don't let that fool you into thinking they wielded the power of the director. In most city-states, politics was a strictly boys' club. Women couldn't speak at the assembly or hold office. But in Sparta, things took an unexpected twist. While the men were busy perfecting their military prowess, Spartan women held the financial reins with a firm grip, quite literally, as they could own and manage land. If you're wondering why Spartan women had biceps that could rival a modern-day personal trainer's, it's because they were expected to maintain the household economy while the men were off doing their warrior thing. In a twist of logic that only the ancient Greeks could pull off, Spartan women's rights were not about equality. They were about practicality. The state needed its soldiers, and who better to ensure the homestead ran smoothly than women who weren't just managing the household, but also overseeing the land. By the 4th century BCE, women owned about 40% of Spartan land. That's not a typo, 40%. It's like giving the keys to the kingdom to the queen while the king is out jousting. Meanwhile, back in Athens, women owning land was about as likely as Zeus trading in his lightning bolts for a desk job. Now, let's talk marriage. the ancient version of let's make a deal. Forget candlelit dinners and roses. This was about strategic alliances and cold, hard cash. Marriage in ancient Greece was less about love and more about survival. A merger, if you will, between families. The dowry was the star of this show, a financial package that could make or break a family's fortune. Think of it as the ancient world's version of venture capital, and if the dowry was mismanaged or lost, it could send a family's financial prospects spiraling faster than a Greek tragedy. The dowry wasn't just a one-off payment, it was a safety net for the bride. If her husband died or the marriage dissolved, guess where she went? Back to her family, and that dowry was supposed to follow her like a faithful sidekick. But in practice, it wasn't always a smooth transfer. The system was rife with loopholes worthy of a modern tax code, and the financial gymnastics needed to reclaim a dowry could leave even the savviest family accountant scratching their head. Despite the odds, some women managed to shake the status quo like a toga in a windstorm. Enter Gorgo, queen of Sparta, daughter of King Cleomenes and wife of King Leonidas. Yes, Leonidas. Of this is Sparta. Fame. Gorgo wasn't just a footnote in history. She was a savvy political player known for her wisdom and wit. When asked why Spartan women were the only ones who could rule men, she famously quipped, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to men." Mic drop, ancient Greece style. Another standout was Aspasia of Miletus, an intellectual tour de force who held her own in the male-dominated world of Athenian politics. Not only was she the partner of Pericles, arguably Athens' most influential statesman, but she also ran a salon that attracted the creme de la creme of Athenian intellectuals. Plato himself credited her with teaching Socrates a thing or two about rhetoric. She was a foreigner, a woman, and a thinker, a trifecta that should have been a one-way ticket to obscurity. But instead, she became a key player in the cultural and political life of Athens. While these women were exceptional, they were the outliers in a society where the average woman's role was more predictable than a Greek chorus. The economic and political systems were designed to keep women in the background, a silent support network ensuring the gears of Greek society kept turning. Yet, within these constraints, women found ways to assert their influence, whether through managing household finances or subtle persuasion in the domestic sphere. The marriage market was another arena where women's economic roles were pivotal. A well-negotiated marriage contract could elevate a family's status and financial standing. It was a calculated chess game, with the dowry as the queen piece, powerful but vulnerable. Families would often stretch their means to provide a substantial dowry, knowing it was an investment in their daughter's future security. But beware the financial misstep. A miscalculated dowry could leave a family's fortunes as shattered as a dropped amphora. In this economic dance, the stakes were high, and the moves were strategic. Women might not have been on the front lines of political battles, but they were deeply entwined in the economic fabric that supported these very systems. Their roles, though often understated, were crucial to maintaining the social order. Even in the realm of mythology, which often mirrors societal values, women were portrayed in ways that reflected their real-world status. Goddesses like Athena and Artemis, though powerful, were exceptions rather than the rule, embodying qualities admired in women: wisdom, chastity, strength, while mortal women were typically cast in more passive roles. This dichotomy highlights a society grappling with the reality of women's roles versus the idealized version. While the legends of goddesses filled the imaginations of young girls, the realities of dowries, domestic management, and economic maneuvering awaited them. The complexity of women's roles in ancient Greece was a reflection of a society both advanced and constrained by its own norms. While the spotlight often shone on the exploits of men, the quiet strength and resilience of women were the hidden gears working tirelessly behind the scenes. As we move forward in this exploration, keep these threads in mind. The political and economic landscapes of ancient Greece were as intertwined as vines on a trellis, with women weaving through them in ways that were both subtle and significant. Their contributions, though often overshadowed by grand narratives, were the backbone of the society that revered democracy, valor, and philosophy, yet struggled with equality. Stay tuned as we unravel more about how these dynamics shaped not just the past, but the echoes they left in the corridors of history. And speaking of echoes in the corridors of history, let's take a stroll down the marble halls of Mount Olympus, where women weren't just supporting roles, they were divine headliners. In the mythological world of ancient Greece, women wielded power that could make even the most fervent feminist raise an eyebrow. Goddesses like Athena, Hera, and Artemis weren't just celestial eye candy. They were forces of nature with portfolios that would make a modern CEO's resume look like a grocery list. Take Athena, for example. Here's a goddess who sprang fully formed from Zeus's forehead. Talk about a grand entrance. As the deity of wisdom and warfare, she was a paradox in a peplos, embodying both the strategic mind and the battle-ready spirit. Her city, Athens, bore her name, and she was revered for her intellect and military prowess. But don't let the shiny armor fool you. Athena was also the goddess of weaving, a nod to the domestic sphere where real Greek women were often confined. It's like being a tech giant and a homemaker rolled into one, showing how versatile female roles could be in the realm of myth, if not in reality. Then there's Hera, Zeus's queen and the goddess of marriage, who had a reputation that would make any soap opera character look tame. Known for her jealousy and vindictive nature, thanks to Zeus's wandering eye, Hera was both revered and feared. Her role in mythology mirrors the complexities of marital dynamics in ancient Greece, where unions were less about love and more about alliances. Hera's mythological marital woes were a divine reflection of earthly struggles, a reminder that even goddesses couldn't escape the drama of domestic life. And who could forget Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and protector of young women? She was the original independent woman, running wild with her band of nymphs and shunning marriage like it was a bad toga party. Artemis was a symbol of female autonomy and strength, admired for her fierce independence. However, her mythology was a stark contrast to the life of a typical Greek woman, who had about as much freedom to roam as a goldfish in a bowl. Artemis was the fantasy of female independence in a society where the reality was often restrictive. While these goddesses presented larger-than-life personas, mortal women were living much different narratives. Take Helen of Troy, for instance. Her face may have launched 1,000 ships, but her story was a cautionary tale of beauty and chaos. As the catalyst for the Trojan War, Helen's legendary allure was both her power and her prison. The real women of Greece certainly weren't starting wars over their looks, but Helen's story served to remind them, and everyone else, that beauty could be both a gift and a curse. In the realm of religion, women were both revered and restricted, much like their goddess counterparts. They played crucial roles in religious ceremonies, often as priestesses, a position that carried a surprising amount of clout. These women could wield influence in religious rituals, and sometimes in local communities, acting as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal. But before you picture a life of divine luxury, remember that being a priestess wasn't all wine and sacrifices. The role came with strict rules and societal expectations, a gilded cage rather than a golden throne. Priestesses of Demeter, for example, held significant sway during the Thesmophoria, a festival dedicated to the goddess of the harvest. This event was one of the few times women could step into the public sphere and influence community life. But the role was as much about duty as it was about empowerment, with responsibilities that reinforced traditional gender roles. The priestess was a guardian of fertility and agriculture, echoing the societal expectation that women were life-givers and caretakers. It was a position of influence, yes, but also one that underscored the societal norms women were expected to uphold. The Oracle of Delphi, perhaps the most famous priestess position, offers another example. Pythia, as she was known, was the mouthpiece of Apollo, dispensing cryptic prophecies that could sway political decisions and determine the outcomes of wars. Her words were as powerful as they were enigmatic, a testament to the influence women could wield in the religious sphere. Yet, despite her stature, Pythia's life was heavily regulated, bound by religious rites and societal expectations that limited her autonomy. The dichotomy between myth and reality is stark. While goddesses roamed freely, wielding power and influence, mortal women were often bound by societal chains, their roles defined by the needs of their city-states. The stories of goddesses like Athena and Artemis offered a form of escapism, a world where women could be warriors and wise leaders. But for the average Greek woman, these tales were as fantastical as unicorns, charming to imagine, but far from attainable. Even within the constraints of their society, women found ways to assert their influence, much like the priestesses who balanced power with piety. Their stories, though overshadowed by the grand exploits of men and guards, were instrumental in shaping the cultural landscape of ancient Greece. They were the architects of rituals and traditions, unseen force behind the societal curtain. In a world that worshipped gods as much as it feared them, the stories of these women, both divine and mortal, were a reminder of the complexities of gender roles. They reflect a society grappling with its own contradictions, where the idealized versions of women in mythology clashed with the harsh realities of their lived experiences. The legends offered a form of empowerment, a vision of what could be, even if reality seldom followed suit. As we continue to pull back the layers of ancient Greece, it's clear that women were both the backbone and the unseen architects of their world. The tales of goddesses and mortals alike serve as a testament to their enduring influence, even in a society that often relegated them to the shadows. As we move forward, keep an eye on these narratives, for they offer a glimpse into the heart of a civilization, and the echoes that still resonate today. As we continue to unravel the threads of ancient Greece, let's pivot from the mythical to the monumental, the cultural contributions of women in arts and literature. If you think the ancient world was all about dusty scrolls and marble statues, think again. It was the stage for a few remarkable women whose voices soared over the din of history, and no one did it quite like Sappho of Lesbos. Her poetry, which dates back to the 6th century BCE, still resonates like a well-tuned lyre, proving that some things, like love and heartache, truly never go out of style. Sappho was a lyrical genius, and her work was so respected that Plato famously dubbed her the 10th Muse. Now, if Plato is giving you a shout-out, you're doing something right. While most of her poetry exists today only in fragments, the emotional depth and clarity of her work are timeless. She wrote about love, longing, and the female experience with a raw honesty that would make even the most seasoned modern poet blush. And let's be honest, anyone who can make the gods of Mount Olympus seem relatable is doing something worth noting. Of course, history being the fickle beast that it is, much of Sappho's life remains shrouded in mystery. What we do know is that she was born on the island of Lesbos, a place that lent its name to the term lesbian, due to her rumored relationships with women. But before you start imagining ancient toga parties, let's clear the air. The legend of Sappho as the poster child of same-sex love is a bit more complicated than our modern interpretations would suggest. Her work celebrated the beauty and complexity of love in all its forms, and while her relationships may have been romantic, they were also deeply intellectual and emotional. In a society where women's voices were often as overlooked as a ghost at a feast, Sappho managed to make a lasting impact. Her poetry was recited, remembered, and revered long after her death. In fact, it was so influential that her hometown of Mytilene even minted coins with her likeness. Talk about leaving a legacy. But here's the catch. Only one complete poem of hers survives to this day, a testament to the selective memory of history, often penned by men who decided what was worth preserving. And let's just say their criteria were as opaque as a Spartan's sense of humor. Sappho wasn't alone in her literary feats. Women across Greece found ways to express themselves through art and literature, even if their contributions were often swallowed by the sands of time. Take Corinna, a poet from Tanagra, whose work rivaled that of her male counterparts. She reportedly bested Pindar. Yes, the asterisk Pindar, the rock star of ancient Greek poetry, in several competitions. Yet her name is a whisper in the annals of history, overshadowed by her male peers. Even when women couldn't publish under their own names, they found ways to leave their mark. Some scholars suggest that women may have contributed anonymously or under pseudonyms, a creative workaround in a patriarchal society. It's like the ancient version of a ghostwriter, but with infinitely more scrolls and fewer book tours. Art was another realm where women carved out their niche. In Athens, the weaving of tapestries wasn't just a household chore, but a respected art form. Aristocratic women, in particular, were known for their skill in creating intricate patterns and designs that often told stories of gods, heroes, and everyday life. These textiles were more than just functional items. They were cultural artifacts that showcased women's artistic talents and provided a canvas for storytelling. But before we get too wrapped up in the romance of it all, let's not forget the reality. These contributions were often overshadowed by their male counterparts. Male historians had a habit of glossing over women's achievements, giving them about as much attention as a background actor in a blockbuster film. It's not that women weren't contributing, it's that they were doing so in a society that often preferred to focus the spotlight elsewhere. Despite these challenges, women's voices found ways to resonate in both public and private spheres. Through poetry, art, and even whispered stories passed from mother to daughter, women of ancient Greece crafted a cultural legacy that transcended their time. Their works may not have always received the recognition they deserved, but they laid the groundwork for future generations of women to pick up the pen or the loom and continue weaving their own tales. As we dig deeper into the layers of history, it's crucial to recognize these contributions, not just for their artistic merit, but for the resilience they represent. Women like Sappho and Corinna weren't just poets. They were pioneers navigating a world that didn't always make space for them. Their stories remind us that even in a society where women's roles were tightly confined, creativity found a way to flourish. The lack of female representation in historical records isn't just an oversight. It's a reminder of the biases that have shaped our understanding of the past. It's a call to action to seek out these hidden voices and bring them to light, to acknowledge the full spectrum of human experience that has shaped our world. As we continue to explore the contributions of women in ancient Greece, let's keep an eye and an ear out for the whispers of history that still echo in our modern lives. And while we're at it, let's not forget the unsung heroines whose names didn't make it into the history books. The women who may not have penned epic poems or woven grand tapestries, but whose daily lives and quiet contributions were the threads in the fabric of their society. These were the mothers, daughters, and sisters who shared stories by the hearth, who sang songs that carried their dreams and hopes, and who, through their everyday acts, kept the cultural heartbeat of Greece alive. Their stories may not have been deemed worthy of record by the scribes of their time, but they are no less vital. They remind us that history is not just the grand narratives of war and politics, but the everyday lives of individuals who shaped their world in ways both big and small. As we continue to peel back the layers of ancient Greece, let's honor these voices, both heard and unheard, and recognize the indelible mark they've left on history. So, as we venture onward in our exploration, let's keep our minds open and our curiosity piqued. There's much more to discover about the cultural tapestry of ancient Greece and the women who, against the odds, wove their threads into its intricate design. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. So, as we venture onward in our exploration, let's keep our minds open and our curiosity piqued. There's much more to discover about the cultural tapestry of ancient Greece and the women who, against the odds, wove their threads into its intricate design. But as we zoom out from the marble busts and mythological grandeur, it's worth pondering how these storied roles and legendary figures have cast their long shadows over modern gender dynamics and societal expectations. For starters, the narrative of women in ancient Greece has, somewhat paradoxically, both shackled and inspired. On one hand, the image of the Greek woman, confined to domesticity, has historically been used to justify keeping women in their place. Fast forward to the Victorian era, you'll find that the ghost of the Gyneceum, the women's quarters, still lingered, shaping ideas about women's roles as the silent supporters of household harmony. Who knew an ancient architectural feature could serve as a blueprint for gender expectations centuries later. Yet, on the flip side, those same myths and stories have become rallying cries for empowerment. Remember Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. She's been adopted as a symbol by many a women's movement, embodying the idea that intellect and strength are not mutually exclusive. And let's not forget the ever-inspiring saga of Spartan women, flexing their metaphorical muscles in a male-dominated world. Their story offers a vintage, yet surprisingly modern, narrative of female agency. But here's where things get interesting. As we acknowledge the strides made since ancient times, it's crucial to recognize that we're still spinning our own myths today. Whether it's the having-it-all narrative or the glorification of the career superwoman, these modern myths can sometimes be as confining as the stories of old. They set up ideals that are as unattainable as a seat on Mount Olympus, leaving many to wonder if they're failing where they've actually been set up to stumble. Consider the workplace, a battlefield that would make Athena proud. Women have made undeniable progress, yet the gender wage gap persists, often disguised under layers of corporate jargon, as opaque as the oracle of Delphi's prophecies. According to the World Economic Forum, it will take another 132 years to close this gap globally. That's longer than the entire timeline of classical Greece. It's a stark reminder that while we may have traded togas for suits, the battle for equality is ongoing. And what about politics, where the Athenian assembly was once a no-girls-allowed club? Today, women are increasingly taking seats at tables where decisions are made, yet they remain the minority in many legislative bodies worldwide. In the U.S., for example, women make up roughly 27% of Congress as of 2023. Progress. Absolutely. A modern-day agora. Not quite. But let's not get too cynical. The fact that we're having these conversations, questioning these narratives, shows that we've come a long way since the days of dowries and domestic seclusion. The echoes of ancient Greece can be heard in the calls for gender parity, in the push for equal pay, and in the celebration of women who break barriers in science, politics, and the arts. These are the Athena and Aspasia of our times, rewriting the script in a world that once relegated women's stories to the margins. Yet, as we reflect on how far we've come, it's clear that the journey is far from over. The myths we create today are tomorrow's history lessons, and it's up to us to decide whether they'll be empowering narratives or cautionary tales. We must remain vigilant, questioning the stories we tell and the roles we assign, ensuring they're as inclusive and varied as the individuals they represent. So, what's the takeaway from our jaunt through the annals of ancient Greek history? Perhaps it's this. While history has often been written in stone, the future is ours to sculpt. The women of ancient Greece, despite the limitations of their time, managed to leave an indelible mark on history. Their stories, both celebrated and unsung, serve as a reminder that progress is possible, even when it seems elusive. We stand on their shoulders, not just to admire the view, but to reach further and aim higher. As we close this chapter, let's carry forward the lessons of the past while keeping our eyes on the horizon. The tapestry of history is ever growing, and each thread we add brings us closer to a future where equality is not just a myth, but a reality. Stay curious, keep questioning, and remember, every story, no matter how ancient, holds the power to inspire change. And who knows, maybe someday future historians will look back at our own age and marvel at the myths we spun and the truths we finally embraced. In the grand tapestry of world history, the Kingdom of Ghana emerges not as an African afterthought, but as a bustling center of commerce and culture, a kind of medieval Silicon Valley, but with gold instead of tech stocks. To truly appreciate this West African marvel, one must first understand the terrain it called home. Picture a vibrant landscape where the Sahara's sandy whispers meet the verdant embrace of the savannah, a geographic mashup that makes you wonder if nature was having a bit of fun. The Kingdom of Ghana, not to be confused with the modern nation-state of Ghana, because that would be like mistaking ancient Rome for modern Italy, was strategically perched between two crucial trade zones, the gold-rich regions to the south and the bustling Berber trade routes to the north. This was the medieval equivalent of setting up your coffee shop between a caffeine-addicted university and a sleep-deprived office block. The location was prime, the kind real estate agents dream about. But this wasn't just about selling location, it was about the gold, baby. Gold was the glittering heart of Ghana's economy, the bling that made the kingdom tick. We're talking about a time when gold wasn't just a luxury. It was the currency, the status symbol, and the economic engine, all rolled into one shiny nugget. The Sarnink people, the founders of this burgeoning kingdom, were no strangers to the strategic advantages of their homeland. They had front-row seats to the gold mines in the Bambuk region, roughly 200 miles to the southwest. This was no small-time operation. Estimates suggest that Ghana controlled 3/4 of the world's gold production at its zenith. That's like being the OPEC of the medieval world. But the Sarnink weren't just sitting on their golden laurels. They were savvy traders, leveraging their prime position to facilitate the movement of goods like salt, copper, and textiles. Think of them as the original middlemen in a time when middlemen weren't just taking a cut, but were the lifeblood of trans-Saharan trade. The salt trade, in particular, was a big deal. In an age before refrigeration, salt wasn't just a seasoning. It was a preservative and a necessity. It was so valuable that it was literally worth its weight in gold. And here we thought our current inflation rates were bad. Now, let's dispel a few myths while we're on this historical road trip. The idea of Ghana as a singular, centralized empire ruled by an omnipotent king in a golden palace is just a tad romanticized. Sure, there were mighty kings, like Tunka-Manen, who reigned around 1062 with such flair that even the most hardened skeptics would be impressed. However, Ghana was more of a federation of sorts, a collection of semi-autonomous chiefdoms that paid homage to a central authority. It's like calling the United States a single city hall, meeting technically true, but missing the messy, vibrant reality. External influences played their part too. The Berbers to the north weren't just passing through. They were cultural and economic influencers before Instagram made it cool. These interactions brought new technologies, such as the camel saddle, which revolutionized trade by making it more efficient to transport goods across the Sahara. Imagine the camel saddle as the medieval equivalent of the shipping container, a game-changer that expanded horizons and fattened wallets. Moreover, the Arab traders brought more than just goods. They brought Islam, which began to spread across the region, weaving itself into the cultural fabric of the land. This wasn't a quick conversion, more of a slow burn, but it reshaped the political and social landscapes over time. By the 11th century, some records suggest that the royal court of Ghana had even adopted Islam, at least in part. The cultural exchanges were rich and complex, like a historical tapestry woven with threads of commerce, religion, and diplomacy. Yet, despite the allure of gold and the influence of external forces, the Kingdom of Ghana remained uniquely itself, defined by its people, its geography, and its role as a node in the vast network of African trade. The Sarnink's ability to adapt, negotiate, and innovate laid the foundation for a kingdom that would, in time, become a legend whispered across continents. In the end, the early history of the Kingdom of Ghana is a testament to the power of place and the ingenuity of its people. Geography may have set the stage, but it was the human actors who brought the drama, the trade deals, and the cultural exchanges that would echo through the centuries. And so, as we continue to explore this fascinating chapter of history, let's keep in mind that the past is as much about the people who lived it as the gold that glittered in their hands. So, having unpacked the early allure and foundation of the Kingdom of Ghana, let's dive deep into the economic engine that propelled this West African powerhouse into the annals of history, the trans-Saharan trade. We're talking about a commercial juggernaut that was the medieval version of Wall Street, but with more camels and fewer digital stock tickers. At the heart of this economic bonanza were gold and salt, the dynamic duo of commodities that turned the gears of Ghana's prosperity. First up, gold. Now I know what you're thinking. Was it really all that glitters? Spoiler alert, it was. Gold was the lifeblood of Ghana's economy, the kind of stuff that got medieval merchants all hot under the collar. Picture this. By the 11th century, Ghana was controlling roughly 2/3 of West Africa's gold supply. That's like possessing a golden goose that never stops laying, except it's more like a whole flock. Gold flowed north to the Berber and Arab traders, who were eager to exchange it for the salt slabs that arrived from the Sahara's depth. This wasn't just a trickle of precious metal. It was a golden torrent that enriched the kingdom's coffers and lined the pockets of its merchants. Speaking of salt, let's not underestimate this ancient wonder. Before refrigeration and preservatives, salt was the MVP of the medieval world. It preserved food, seasoned dishes, and importantly, preserved life. In the Kingdom of Ghana, salt was quite literally worth its weight in gold. That's right, folks. We're talking about an era where the phrase, "take it with a pinch of salt," might have referred to a small fortune. The Sahara may have been a brutal, unforgiving expanse, but it was also home to vast salt deposits. These salt mines at Taghaza and Taoudeni were the medieval equivalent of drilling for oil, messy, dangerous, but ultimately lucrative. Now, you might be wondering how on earth these two commodities ended up crisscrossing the desert. Enter the camel, the unassuming hero of our tale. These ships of the desert were the medieval semi-trucks, hauling goods across the Sahara with a stubborn resilience that would make any modern delivery service blush. The introduction of the camel saddle around 500 AD was a game-changer, transforming long and arduous treks into slightly less long, but far more profitable, jaunts. Camels could carry loads up to 600 pounds and travel distances previously thought impassable, turning the Sahara from a daunting barrier into a bustling highway. Imagine a convoy of these humpbacked heroes plodding across the sand, laden with gold, salt, textiles, and more. It was a sight to behold, a moving testament to human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of profit. The wealth amassed from this trade didn't just line the royal treasury, it fueled the kingdom's expansion and sophistication. Ghana's rulers built impressive cities, with Cambysail emerging as the dazzling heart of the empire. At its peak, Cambysail was a sprawling metropolis, boasting a population of around 20,000, a significant number for the time. It was a city of two halves. One section was the bustling commercial hub, teeming with traders, artisans, and merchants. The other was the royal city, where the king's court resided in splendor. Imagine the city as an ancient Manhattan, but instead of skyscrapers, it had mud-brick palaces and bustling markets. This burgeoning wealth also meant that Ghana could afford a formidable army, essential for protecting its interests and keeping rebellious vassals in check. The king's soldiers were kitted out in chain mail and armed with weaponry that would make any rival think twice before encroaching on Ghanaian territory. This wasn't just a kingdom content to rest on its laurels. It was a dynamic, expansive force, ready to defend its assets and assert its dominance. Of course, the trans-Saharan trade routes were like the medieval Silk Road, minus the silk and with a lot more sand. These routes didn't just carry goods, they were conduits for ideas, technologies, and cultures. The interactions along these trade networks were as complex as they were enriching. Berber and Arab traders brought not only their goods, but also their customs, languages, and religious beliefs. Islam, in particular, began to take root, subtly reshaping the cultural and political landscapes of Ghana. By the 11th century, the royal court had embraced Islam to a certain extent, a savvy move that reinforced trade ties and diplomatic relations with Muslim merchants and states. Yet, for all the romance of gold-laden caravans and bustling markets, let's not forget the harsher realities. Life as a trader or laborer in this era was no picnic. The Sahara was a harsh mistress, with searing heat by day and biting cold by night. Sandstorms could whip up without warning, and water sources were scarce. Many a trader set off with dreams of riches, only to find themselves at the mercy of this unforgiving landscape. Even the cities, with their wealth and vibrancy, were not immune to the social and political tensions that come with rapid expansion and cultural integration. So, as we unravel the economic tapestry of the Kingdom of Ghana, it's clear that this was a land of contrast and complexity. The wealth generated from the trans-Saharan trade was the catalyst for Ghana's rise, but it was also a double-edged sword, bringing prosperity and challenges in equal measure. The kingdom's story is one of human resilience and ambition, a testament to the enduring power of trade and the indomitable spirit of those who dared to traverse the sands. And as we continue our journey through this remarkable chapter of history, remember that every glittering gold coin and every grain of salt tells a story of dreams, daring, and the relentless quest for prosperity. Stay tuned, because there's much more to uncover in the saga of the Kingdom of Ghana. So, with the Kingdom of Ghana's economic engine roaring like a medieval stock market on steroids, let's swivel our historical spotlight onto the political machinery that kept this West African powerhouse ticking. At the helm of this golden juggernaut was the king, the titular Ghana, which wasn't just a name, but a title that packed more punch than an ancient rock star's stage name. Picture a ruler whose clout stretched from the banks of the Senegal River to the edges of the Sahara, a man well versed in the art of ruling not by brute force alone, but through a delicate dance of diplomacy, cunning, and the occasional threat of a royal smackdown. Now, before you conjure images of a solitary figure perched on a golden throne, barking orders with a scepter in hand, let's add some layers. The Ghana wasn't a lone wolf. He was more like the CEO of a sprawling corporation, surrounded by a cabinet of advisors, chieftains, and local officials who helped steer the ship. This wasn't a one-man show. It was a symphonic blend of central authority and local governance, where the king wielded power but knew when to delegate, a bit like running a medieval Fortune 500 company with tribal chiefs as your board of directors. The heart of this political structure was the king's court, a bustling hive of activity where decisions were made, alliances forged, and sometimes a bit of theatrical drama played out. The court was composed of ministers overseeing various aspects of governance, from finance to defense, ensuring that the kingdom's affairs ran as smoothly as a camel caravan across the desert. Among these ministers, the chief justice and head treasurer were particularly crucial, wielding power that could make or break careers, and occasionally necks. The Ghana's ability to maintain order across vast territories wasn't just down to a well-oiled administrative machine. It was also about understanding the art of balance, striking the right chord between granting autonomy to local leaders and ensuring their loyalty to the central throne. Think of it as a game of medieval chess, where each chiefdom was a piece on the board, and the king had to anticipate moves, forge alliances, and occasionally sacrifice a pawn to protect the kingdom's interests. Local rulers were allowed a fair degree of autonomy, which kept them invested in the kingdom's success, but they knew that stepping out of line could result in a not-so-friendly visit from the king's army. And speaking of armies, let's not forget the martial might that backed up all the Ghana's diplomatic niceties. The kingdom's military was no ragtag band of warriors. It was a disciplined force, well-equipped and ready to defend the kingdom's borders or quell any internal dissent. Soldiers were often drawn from the ranks of the kingdom's subjects, with the king's personal guard comprising elite warriors who were the medieval equivalent of special forces, minus the camo gear. These warriors were essential in maintaining peace and order, but also in showcasing the kingdom's might to neighboring lands. The message was clear. We come in peace, but we're ready for war if you push our buttons. Yet, the Ghana didn't rely solely on military strength. Diplomacy was a key tool in his arsenal, and he wielded it with finesse that would make any modern statesman nod in approval. Treaties and alliances were crafted with a keen eye for detail, ensuring that trade routes remained open and the kingdom's position remained unchallenged. These diplomatic endeavors weren't without their comedic moments, though. Overambitious nobles sometimes got a bit too big for their sandals, believing their own press releases and attempting to carve out personal fiefdoms. The Ghana, ever the wily leader, knew how to rein them in, often with a mix of tough love and the occasional public humiliation to remind them who held the real power. In the grand scheme of things, the political structure of the Kingdom of Ghana was a remarkable feat of governance, a testament to the ingenuity and adaptability of its leaders. It was a system that blended centralized power with local autonomy, backed by military might and shrewd diplomacy. Yet, for all its sophistication, the kingdom was not impervious to the currents of change. External pressures, internal strife, and the relentless march of time would eventually test the kingdom's resilience. As we continue to unravel the saga of the Kingdom of Ghana, let's keep in mind that history is not just about grand narratives and glorious achievements. It's about the people who navigated the challenges and opportunities of their time, crafting a legacy that echoes through the ages. Keep your curiosity piqued, because the story is far from over, and the sands of time still have much to reveal about this legendary kingdom. And speaking of echoes through the ages, let's tune our ears to the real soundscape of the Kingdom of Ghana, the vibrant hum of cultural and societal life. This wasn't just a kingdom of gold and glory. It was a dynamic society with its own rhythm, where the beat of the drum was as crucial as the clink of coins. First up, religion. Picture a land where Islam and traditional African religions mingled like two different bands sharing the same stage. By the time Islam made its way into Ghana, it was more than just a passing trend. Traders and Islamic scholars brought the religion along trade routes, like a new mixtape everyone wanted to hear. But don't imagine a sudden religious coup. It was more of a slow jam. Islam blended into the existing spiritual landscape, which was rich with animism and ancestor worship. It was a bit like watching two rival bands merging into one supergroup with the occasional discordant note. The royal court and some urban centers leaned towards Islam, not just for spiritual enlightenment, but also because it was the smart move for trade and diplomacy. Meanwhile, the countryside clung to traditional beliefs, creating a cultural tapestry that was as diverse as it was colorful. This blending wasn't always harmonious. Picture a family dinner where everyone's arguing about whose dish tastes better, but in the end, they all still eat together. Tensions simmered, but they also led to a fascinating fusion of ideas and practices. Now, while religion set some of the stage, let's not forget the arts, the true rock stars of cultural expression. Ghana was a land of skilled artisans and craftspeople who turned raw materials into masterpieces. Goldsmiths crafted intricate jewelry that would have made any modern influencer drool. Textiles adorned bodies like wearable art, with vibrant patterns that told stories of their own. And then there were the sculptures and carvings, expressions in wood and stone that captured the essence of the human experience. If you think modern art is daring, just wait until you see what these ancient artists got up to. Amidst this rich cultural milieu, griots were the unsung heroes, or should I say, the sung heroes. These oral historians were the original podcasters, spinning tales of history, legend, and genealogy with a flair that would make any storyteller green with envy. Griots were keepers of knowledge, human libraries, with memories sharper than a camel trader's bargaining skills. Their performances were part history lesson, part entertainment, and wholly captivating. They preserved the kingdom's stories, ensuring that the deeds of kings and commoners alike echoed down the generations. Yet, as we romanticize the past, it's easy to overlook the gritty reality of daily life in medieval Ghana. Sure, there were moments of splendor, but life was often a grind. The majority of people were farmers, toiling in the fields from dawn till dusk. The kingdom's agriculture wasn't just a backdrop. It was the backbone, crucial for sustaining urban centers and fueling trade. The crops were varied, with millet, sorghum, and yams being staple foods. Picture a medieval Whole Foods, but with a lot more manual labor and a lot less air conditioning. Life was communal, with extended families living in compounds, sharing resources and responsibilities. It was a world where everyone had a role to play, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent. And while this sounds idyllic, it also meant there was no such thing as me time. Privacy was a luxury, and personal space was about as rare as gold nuggets in your backyard. Speaking of luxuries, let's talk fashion. The average Ghanaian's wardrobe was practical, made for the climate and the demands of daily life. But that didn't mean it was drab. People adorned themselves with colorful fabrics and jewelry that reflected their social status and personal tastes. It was less about keeping up with the Joneses and more about standing out in a crowd. And for those wondering about hygiene in a time before hot showers, well, let's just say the kingdom had its own methods. Bathing was important, but it relied more on nearby water sources than on modern plumbing. So, as we peel back the layers of the Kingdom of Ghana, it's clear that this was a society of contrasts and complexities. It was a place where gold and grit coexisted, where tradition and innovation danced a delicate waltz. The kingdom's cultural richness was as integral to its identity as its economic might. And as we continue to explore this fascinating chapter of history, let's remember that the past is not just a museum piece to be admired from a distance. It's a living, breathing narrative full of human endeavors, triumphs, and tribulations. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover in the saga of the Kingdom of Ghana, and this historical journey is far from over. And as we continue to explore the saga of the Kingdom of Ghana, we find ourselves at that inevitable crossroad where prosperity begins to feel the weight of its own success. You see, even an empire built on golden foundations isn't immune to the sands of time and the grind of geopolitical pressures. It's like having a mansion built on a beach. Eventually, the tide rolls in. So, what caused this golden kingdom to start sinking? First, let's talk external pressures that hit like a historical hurricane. Enter the Almoravids, those zealous warriors from the sands of North Africa. Around the 11th century, they swept down like a desert storm, carrying the banner of Islam and a keen sense of expansionism. Now, you might think of them as the medieval version of a corporate raider, only with more swords and fewer hostile takeover bids. The Almoravids were all about spreading their religious fervor and increasing their territorial grip, which meant that Ghana had a problem on its hands bigger than a camel with a bad attitude. The Almoravid invasions around 1076 were less about conquest for conquest's sake and more about controlling those lucrative trade routes that Ghana held dear. If you want to cripple a kingdom, attack its lifeline, and for Ghana that was trade. Yet, external pressures were just one piece of this historical jigsaw. Internally, the kingdom was facing its own set of stress fractures. Overextension was one of them. Ghana's territory had expanded, but kingdoms aren't like elastic waistbands. They can't stretch indefinitely without snapping. Managing such a vast area with a complex web of trade routes and vassal states meant that resources were spread thin, and governance became a logistical nightmare. It was like trying to run a multinational corporation with a rotary phone and snail mail. Resource depletion also played its card. The gold mines, once a seemingly inexhaustible font of wealth, began to run dry. Over-reliance on a single resource is an economic pitfall we've seen time and again. Just ask any fossil fuel-dependent country today. As the gold waned, so too did the kingdom's ability to maintain its military might and infrastructure. And without the financial clout to back its ambitions, Ghana found itself in a precarious position. Political instability was the cherry on top of this crumbling cake. As we'd seen, the kingdom was more of a federation than a centralized state, and this delicate balance was easily disrupted. Local chieftains, sensing the weakened grip of the central authority, began flexing their muscles. Rebellions and internal squabbles were like termites gnawing away at the foundations of power. It was a classic case of too many cooks in the political kitchen, each with their own recipe for disaster. What about the cultural and religious dynamics? Well, they added fuel to the fire. As Islam gained a stronger foothold, it sometimes clashed with traditional practices, creating rifts that were more than just religious disagreements. It was a cultural identity crisis, a struggle between the old and the new that left the kingdom divided and weakened from within. It's the age-old story of progress versus tradition, and in this case, it was a stalemate that left both sides exhausted. As the dust settled, once mighty kingdom of Ghana had fractured, paving the way for new players to take the stage. Yet, the story doesn't end with a simple fade to black. Ghana's legacy lingered, influencing subsequent West African empires like Mali and Songhai. They learned from Ghana's successes and failures, adapting the lessons of history with the wisdom of hindsight. If Ghana was the blueprint, then Mali and Songhai were the upgraded models, each adding their own twist to the tale of empire building. In modern times, the myths and realities of Ghana's rise and fall continue to shape perceptions of African history. Romanticized narratives often painted as a golden utopia, forgetting the gritty realities that accompanied such grandeur. Yet, it's crucial to remember that these empires were complex societies with their own challenges and triumphs. By acknowledging the full spectrum of their story, we gain a richer understanding of the past and a clearer perspective on the present. The Kingdom of Ghana stands as a testament to the dynamic interplay of geography, trade, and human ambition. It reminds us that no empire, no matter how golden, is invincible. History is not a static tableau, but a series of ebbs and flows, driven by the people who navigate the tumultuous tides of their time. It's a lesson in resilience and adaptability, a reminder that even as fortunes rise and fall, the human spirit endures, ever striving for prosperity and progress. As we close the chapter on the Kingdom of Ghana, let's carry forward the understanding that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a tapestry woven with the threads of human experience. It's a narrative that continues to unfold, challenging us to learn, to question, and to grow. So, as you drift off to sleep with visions of gold and grit, remember that the story of Ghana is not just a tale of what was lost, but a celebration of what was and what can be learned. And with that, let the sands of time gently carry you into dreams of a world where history is alive with possibility. In the bustling streets of 4th century India, the air was thick with the scent of spices and the sound of ambition. Enter the scene, Chandragupta I, a ruler with a name as grand as his aspirations. Around 320 CE, he wasn't just flipping through the scrolls of history, he was riding them with the Gupta Dynasty as his pen. Now, if you're looking for a Cinderella story, you might want to turn the page. Chandragupta I didn't wait for any fairy godmother. He married into power, forging alliances with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. His marriage to Kumaradvi of the Lichchavi clan wasn't just a romantic subplot. It was a masterstroke in political chess, securing not just love, but land. As the Gupta dynasty blossomed, it wasn't just about swapping rings and signing treaties. A dash of military might was always on the menu. Chandragupta I and his successors weren't shy about flexing their muscles when diplomacy needed a little nudge. By the time his descendant Samudragupta hit the scene, the empire stretched its arms across the Indian subcontinent like a well-fed octopus, with tentacles reaching from the Himalayas to the southern tips of India. Samudragupta, the empire's second emperor, was the kind of ruler who'd have made his ancestors proud, and maybe a little nervous. Armed with ambition and a penchant for poetry, he wasn't content to just sit on his throne. No, Samudragupta was out there, conquering more than 20 kingdoms, from the Ganges to the southern fringes of the subcontinent, and leaving a trail of awe and fear. His campaigns were recorded in the Allahabad pillar inscription, which, if you squint, reads like the Rockstar Tour itinerary of a man who knew how to make an entrance. But let's not get too carried away by the romance of conquest and courtly intrigue. Behind the velvet curtains of imperial power was the clinking of coins and the hum of trade. The Guptas were savvy, turning their empire into a commercial powerhouse that even their rivals envied. They sat on trade routes that were the economic superhighways of their time, including the famed Silk Road. This wasn't just a path for silks and spices. It was a gold mine, literally and figuratively. The Guptas tapped into these routes, facilitating trade that stretched from China to the Mediterranean, bringing not just wealth, but a cultural exchange that made their empire a melting pot of ideas and innovations. In this era of prosperity, the Gupta economy was as diverse as it was robust. From textiles to metallurgy, the empire's economy thrived on a range of industries that were the envy of their time. Indian artisans weren't just creating goods, they were crafting legacies. Gupta coins, for instance, weren't just currency, they were art, often depicting the rulers themselves in a display of imperial swagger. The economy was bolstered by an agricultural backbone that would make any empire proud. Fertile lands along the Ganges provided the grain that fed the growing population, while the empire's administration ensured that taxes were collected with the precision of a well-tuned sitter. What about the myth-busting, you ask? Guptas are often painted as the golden age of India, a period of peace and prosperity that was unparalleled. And while there's truth in that shiny narrative, it's also true that the Guptas weren't exactly sitting around in lotus ponds, sipping mango lasses. Their peace was won through a combination of astute diplomacy and, let's face it, the occasional sword fight. The empire's stability was as much about strategic marriages and clever alliances as it was about military might. The Gupta dynasty's rise was no accident of history. It was a calculated ascent, crafted by leaders who understood the intricate dance of power. Chandragupta, and his successors, weren't just rulers. They were architects of an empire that would set the stage for India's cultural and economic blossoming. So, as you drift off to sleep pondering these tales of yore, remember this. The Guptas didn't just inherit history, they built it, one strategic move at a time. So, while the Guptas were busy laying the foundations of an empire that would be the envy of history books, they were also nurturing a cultural and intellectual renaissance. And no, this wasn't just about wearing fancy hats or commissioning self-flattering sculptures. We're talking about a period where brains were the real currency, and the Gupta dynasty was minting them like nobody's business. First stop on our intellectual tour, mathematics. If you've ever cursed your high school math teacher, spare a thought for Aryabhata, one of the heavyweights of Gupta-era intellect. While some of us were struggling with basic algebra, Aryabhata was busy pioneering trigonometry around 499 CE. He calculated the value of pi to 4 decimal places, and even figured out that the Earth rotates on its axis, which, let's face it, was a pretty big brainwave for a guy living when most people thought the Earth was flatter than a naan bread. But Aryabhata didn't stop there. He was also knee-deep in astronomical calculations, predicting solar and lunar eclipses with a precision that would make even modern stargazers nod in respect. Now, let's tackle the big myth that everyone loves to romanticize, the invention of zero. The humble zero, a concept so simple, yet so revolutionary. The popular tale is that the Guptas invented zero out of thin air, like pulling a rabbit out of a hat. But the reality is a bit more nuanced. The concept of zero as a placeholder had been floating around before the Guptas took over, seen in Babylonian and Mayan cultures. However, it was during this era that zero was fully embraced in the Indian numerical system, morphing from an idea into a fundamental building block of mathematics. So, credit where credit's due. The Guptas took Zero from being a quirky side character to a leading role in the numerical drama. But it wasn't just about numbers and stars. The Gupta period was a golden age for literature, too. Kalidasa, often compared to Shakespeare, was penning plays and poems that would echo through the ages. His works like Shakuntala are still celebrated today, proving that love stories and tragic heroes never go out of style. And it's not just about the romantic plots. Kalidasa's sophisticated use of language and rich imagery set a high bar for future literary endeavors. Yet, for all its intellectual bling, was the Gupta's golden age truly golden for everyone involved? Well, not exactly. While the elite were busy discussing the finer points of Sanskrit grammar, the majority of the population was toiling away, ensuring that the empire's economic engine stayed well-oiled. The caste system, deeply entrenched in Indian society, didn't just vanish with the rise of cultural achievements. If anything, it solidified, ensuring that while some were counting stars, others were stuck counting grains of rice. Moreover, the political landscape wasn't all sunshine and trigonometry. The Gupta rulers, despite their cultural patronage, were as human as any. Their reigns were marked by power struggles and territorial ambitions, proving that even in a golden age, the lure of power could tarnish the shine. The empire's expansion often came at the cost of smaller kingdoms, absorbed into the Gupta fold not always by choice, but by necessity or force. And here's a little nugget for thought. While the Gupta economy thrived on trade, not everyone benefited equally. The routes were rich, sure, but they were also perilous. Bandits loved the opulence of these trade paths as much as the traders did. The idea of a peaceful, prosperous empire is intoxicating, but the reality on the ground was a bit grittier. Merchants had to navigate not just the economic tides, but also the very real threat of losing everything to a well-armed highwayman. So, as you ponder the so-called golden glow of the Gupta era, remember that it wasn't all celestial navigation and poetic verses. Behind the curtain of cultural achievements lay a complex world of social hierarchies, economic disparities, and political machinations. The Guptas may have painted their legacy in gold, but the canvas was more colorful than history often admits. As we pause this chapter of the tale, keep in mind that history is as much about what's unsaid as what's recorded. Stay tuned, because the Gupta saga is far from over. So, as the ink dries on our tale of Gupta intelligence and economic prowess, let's pivot to the spectacle that was the Gupta arts and architecture. This wasn't just an era of numbers and trade routes. It was a canvas where rock and pigment came alive, and stories were etched into the fabric of time. Enter the Ajanta and Ellora caves, a testament to human creativity, and let's be honest, some serious elbow grease. First up, the Ajanta caves. Picture this, around 30 rock-cut Buddhist cave monuments, dating from the 2nd century BCE to about 480 CE, nestled in the Maharashtra cliffs. Yeah, we're talking a real-life Flintstones meets Indiana Jones scenario. But unlike Fred Stonecar, these caves weren't just for show. They were monastic retreats for Buddhist monks, intricately adorned with frescoes and carvings that depicted tales from the Jataka, stories of the Buddha's previous lives. It's a bit like Netflix for the ancient world, only with more meditation and fewer plot twists. Now, the romantic notion is that some enlightened monks with chisels and a lot of time on their hands crafted these wonders. But let's dig deeper, literally. The heavy lifting, quite literally, was done by skilled laborers and artisans who chipped away at solid rock without the luxury of modern tools. Imagine the clink of hammers and the dust clouds as these unsung heroes sculpted intricate columns and vaulted ceilings. And let's not even start on the logistics, hauling materials and feeding the workforce in an era without Grubhub or forklifts. Then there's Ellora, a little over 100 kilometers away, offering a smorgasbord of religious art from Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. These caves, 34 to be exact, were carved between the 6th and 11th centuries, showcasing the Gupta influence on architecture well beyond their political zenith. The Piece de Resistance, the Kailasa Temple, a monolithic structure dedicated to Lord Shiva, carved from a single rock. It's like the ancient world's version of "Look what I can do," with a side of divine devotion. But let's not pretend these architectural marvels were all sunshine and spiritual enlightenment. The Gupta rulers, while patrons of the arts, also had political motives. Supporting such grand projects was a way to flex their cultural muscles and cement their legacy in stone. Literally. It was about showcasing power and piety, a strategic play in the empire-building handbook. Shifting gears, let's talk about the literary landscape of the Gupta dynasty. Enter Kalidasa, the bard of the subcontinent. Often hailed as the Shakespeare of India, Kalidasa's works have endured the test of time, notably without the brooding Skardish castles or existential dread. Instead, his plays and poems like Shakuntala and Meghajuta were awash with romance, nature, and a lyrical elegance that could make even the most hardened critic swoon. His work didn't just entertain, it elevated Sanskrit to a literary art form, a lingua franca of the educated elite. However, let's not put rose-colored glasses on too tightly. While Kalidasa was spinning tales of love and longing, the reality of the theatre world was less glamorous. Performances weren't just for the elite. They were often staged at festivals and public gatherings, where the audience could be as rowdy as a modern-day rock concert. The actors, they were versatile performers who doubled as stager hands, and sometimes even the sound crew. Talk about multitasking. Moreover, literature and theatre weren't just about artistic expression. They were tools of influence and education. They reflected societal norms, values, and politics, subtly reinforcing the social hierarchy. The stories often mirrored the Gupta ideal of dharma, or duty, subtly reminding audiences about the importance of sticking to one's societal role. It was a world where art and propaganda waltzed hand in hand, each step a reflection of the empire's ethos. And while we're unraveling the tapestry of Gupta culture, let's not overlook the economic context. Supporting artists, architects, and playwrights wasn't just altruism, it was an investment. These cultural endeavors promoted unity and identity across the empire, fostering a sense of pride and belonging. It was a strategic move that helped weld the vast, diverse territories into a coherent whole, a bit like ancient soft power diplomacy. So, as we marvel at the Gupta dynasty's artistic and architectural splendors, let's remember the people behind the curtain, the artisans in the dust, the playwrights with ink-stained fingers, and the monarchs balancing between patronage and politics. The Gupta era may glitter with artistic brilliance, but its true beauty lies in the complex interplay of power, creativity, and ambition. The Gupta legacy is more than a highlight reel of cultural achievements. It's a reminder that history is crafted by many hands, driven by myriad motives. As we press pause on this chapter, stay tuned for more tales from this golden age, because the Gupta story is far from over, and who knows what twists the next act will bring. As we ease back into the vibrant world of the Guptas, let's shift our gaze from the chisels and quills to the incense and ideologies that shaped this remarkable era. The Gupta dynasty wasn't just a golden age of arts and intellect. It was a spiritual renaissance where Hinduism took center stage, like a seasoned actor reclaiming the spotlight after a few centuries in the wings. Hinduism, with its pantheon of deities, intricate rituals, and philosophical depth, experienced a resurgence so pronounced it could rival a rock band's reunion tour. But before you get swept away by idyllic visions of serene sages and divine devotion, let's throw a cold splash of reality onto the canvas. This was an age where spiritual enlightenment coexisted with rigid social hierarchies. Think of it as a cosmic club where not everyone made it past the bouncer. The caste system, deeply entrenched in Indian society, was as unyielding as a game of chess with no chance for a pawn to become a queen. The four Varnas, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras were more than just social categories. They were the DNA of Gupta society, dictating one's role, duties, and destiny with an ironclad certainty. Now, let's debunk a myth or two while we're at it. The notion of the caste system being a harmonious societal order is about as realistic as a Bollywood dance sequence breaking out in a board meeting. The truth, it was a social straitjacket, where upward mobility was as rare as a monsoon in the Sahara. While the Brahmins enjoyed the privileges of priesthood and education, the Shudras found themselves tethered to labor, with little hope of advancement. And if you think that was tough, spare a thought for those outside the Varna system altogether, the so-called untouchables, who navigated life on the fringes, facing ostracism like a bad plot twist that wouldn't resolve. In this complex societal tapestry, gender roles were another thread tightly woven into the fabric. Women, for all their grace and intellect, were often relegated to the domestic sphere, their lives dictated by the patriarchal norms of the time. While there were exceptions, women who broke through the constraints to become scholars and poets, these were the outliers, not the norm. The Manus Mridi, a key legal text of the era, didn't exactly champion gender equality, prescribing roles that kept women under the guardianship of their fathers, husbands and sons. A stark reminder that even in an age of enlightenment, the shadows of tradition loomed large. Yet, amidst this rigid social structure, the Gupta dynasty boasted a religiously pluralistic society that was almost paradoxical in its tolerance. Hinduism's ascendancy didn't snuff out the other faiths. Buddhism and Jainism continued to thrive, offering a curious case study in ancient pluralism. They coexisted, not just in the hearts of the people, but in the landscape itself, with stupas and temples standing side by side, like philosophical debate partners who respectfully agreed to disagree. This was a time when spiritual diversity wasn't just tolerated. It was a vibrant part of the social fabric, a testament to human capacity for coexistence even amidst profound differences. But let's not romanticize this pluralism too much. While the Guptas were patrons of all major faiths, this wasn't solely out of a benevolent desire for unity. It was a shrewd political maneuver, ensuring stability across a diverse empire where religious allegiance often intertwined with regional identity. Supporting various religions was a way to keep the peace and prevent the kind of ideological rifts that could turn a thriving empire into a fractious powder keg. It was as much about strategic governance as it was about spiritual patronage, an early form of realpolitik with a divine twist. Economically, this religious tapestry was more than just a spiritual mosaic. It was also an asset. Pilgrimages brought trade and prosperity to religious centers, turning spirituality into a booming business model. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were hubs of economic activity, attracting artisans, merchants, and pilgrims alike. The flow of wealth and ideas through these sacred sites was both a testament to the Guptas' economic savvy and a reflection of the interconnectedness of their world. So, while the Guptas fostered a society where hymns and hymns of praise filled the air, let's not forget the earthly realities that shaped these spiritual harmonies. The era's social and religious fabric was a blend of devotion and division, enlightenment and entrenchment. As we pause to reflect on this tapestry of belief and identity, remember that history is as much about the unseen threads as the bold patterns they create. Stay tuned, because the Gupta saga still has more layers to unravel, like a story where every chapter leaves you wanting more, curious about what lies just beyond the page. As we transition from the spiritual symphony that was the Gupta era, let's not sugarcoat what came next. A decline that reads like a script penned by Shakespeare himself, complete with invasions, intrigue, and a touch of inevitability. By the mid-6th century, the empire was buckling under external pressures and internal fractures, like a grand old mansion with termites in the woodwork. The empire's once unshakable foundations trembled as the Huns, yes, the very same folks who gave the Romans sleepless nights, stormed in like uninvited guests at a wedding, bringing chaos and calamity in their wake. The Huns, specifically the Altshan Huns led by the formidable Toramana and his son Miharacula, were no mere footnote in history. They charged into India around 500 CE with the subtlety of a bull in a china shop, toppling the Guptas' northern strongholds and leaving a trail of devastation that made even the most battle-hardened veterans of the era shudder. The Huns weren't just after territory, they were after dominance, dismantling the Gupta administration with a precision that could rival a modern-day corporation's hostile takeover. For the Guptas, this was less of a dramatic crash and more of a slow, painful unraveling, akin to watching a beloved TV show lose its way in its final seasons. Now, let's dive into the economic undercurrents of this decline. The Huns' incursions severely disrupted the lucrative trade routes that had once been the empire's lifeline. With the Silk Road under siege, the economic engine that fueled Gupta prosperity started to sputter, plunging towns and traders into a financial quagmire. It's a bit like losing your Wi-Fi in the middle of a crucial Zoom call, except replace mild inconvenience with existential dread. Internally, The Gupta dynasty wasn't exactly the picture of harmony either. Political fragmentation and dynastic infighting were the order of the day, as regional governors, once loyal vassals, saw the writing on the wall and decided to play kingmaker themselves. The empire splintered into a mosaic of smaller kingdoms, each vying for supremacy in a chaotic game of thrones. This internal strife was as much a cause of the collapse as the Hun invasions, proof that sometimes the call is coming from inside the house. But let's not romanticize the Guptas as helpless victims of circumstance. Their decline also speaks to the inherent vulnerabilities of any expansive empire, a reminder that the higher you climb, the harder you fall. The Gupta administration, initially a marvel of efficiency, became bloated and unwieldy, struggling to maintain control over its sprawling territories. The very strategies that had once secured their dominance, strategic marriages, military prowess, and economic acumen, proved insufficient against the twin tides of foreign invasion and domestic discord. So, as the curtains fall on the Gupta stage, what remains of their legacy? Was the golden age truly golden, or was it just a gilded veneer over a more complex reality? Well, that's where things get interesting. Despite their fall, the Guptas left an indelible mark on the subcontinent. Their contributions to art, science, and culture were like a playlist that transcends generations, songs of intellectual and artistic achievement that still echo today. The Gupta era's embrace of zero, its architectural marvels, and its literary triumphs have influenced countless cultures and continue to shape the world in ways that even they couldn't have imagined. Yet, the glittering narrative of a utopian age belies the era's stark realities. Beneath the cultural renaissance lay economic disparities, social hierarchies, and an empire built on the backs of those who had little say in its grandeur. The tales of courtly splendor and intellectual triumph are tempered by the knowledge that for many, life in the Gupta Empire was less about golden dreams and more about the daily grind. As we ponder the lessons of the Gupta dynasty, let's remember the duality of their legacy. It's a tale of ambition and hubris, of enlightenment and exploitation, a reminder that history is a tapestry woven from the threads of triumph and tragedy. The Guptas may have faded into the annals of history, but their story remains a poignant testament to the complexities of human endeavor. In the end, the Gupta legacy isn't just a relic of the past. It's a mirror reflecting the eternal dance of power and principle, a dance that continues to play out on the stage of history today. So, as you turn off the lights and settle into your thoughts, remember this. History is as much about the lessons we learn as it is about the stories we tell.